Hello, and welcome to those of you joining us on Zoom. If you'll just give us a moment for everyone to load into our Zoom room, we will get started in just a moment. Welcome to WIDA's 8th Annual Washington International Trade Conference. We are grateful to all of you who could join us for this hybrid event. At this year's conference, we're discussing key themes contained in the Trump administration's 2025 National Security Strategy, the NSS, which draws a clear link between economic security and national security. Like the NSS, our conference this year focuses on key trade and trade-adjacent issues such as artificial intelligence, critical minerals, and U.S. leadership on manufacturing and trade. Today's sessions will be fully online for all attendees. Tomorrow, all sessions will be streamed via Zoom. But if you're in DC, we hope to see you in person in the Ronald Reagan Building for a discussion with thought leaders on politics, trade, foreign policy, and national security. And please note, and as we've added a new session for tomorrow's conference to discuss the IEEPA ruling and what might come next. That session will start at 12:45 p.m. Eastern Time and will close out our conference tomorrow. Information on that is in our event program and on our website, www.wita.org. We'd like to say a special thanks to our sponsors whose names are on the screen right now. Their generous support is essential to our mission to bring the trade community together for high-quality, high-impact discussion of U.S. and international trade policies. We have a packed schedule today and tomorrow, and we're thrilled you're all here today. Before we get to today's program, a few notes for everyone. If you need to log out and come back in, your link for today should serve to readmit you back into the conference. You'll get a separate link for tomorrow's sessions. During each session, we'll try to get to audience questions either during the conversation or towards the end. Please use the Q&A tab in Zoom, and you can submit questions as we go. And if you're having any problems with your Zoom feed, you can email us at events@wita.org. And our team can try to help you solve your connection problems. Following today's program, we'll send email links out to watch the broadcast if you have missed any part of it. If you've been on any of our sessions before, you know we like to call out the names of people who you are in community with at our events, even if you can't see them on Zoom. If we have time, I'll try to call out people before we start each session. We're pleased to welcome several of our conference sponsors: Ara Auduro, Ari Giovenco, and Amir Nassar with Amazon, Maria Ziba with the National Pork Producers Council, Laura Black and Renee Pfeiffer and the team at White & Case, and Nassim Fussell with the Business Roundtable. Thank you to Amazon, National Pork Producers Council, White & Case, and Business Roundtable for sponsoring our conference this year. We're truly grateful. And thanks, of course, to all of you for joining us. If you are registered to attend the conference, you should have received a link to our conference program by email this morning, which contains bios for each of our speakers so we can dispense with lengthy introductions. And I'd like to ask them each to please turn on their cameras. Welcome today to Sara Schuman, who's a managing director at Beacon Global Strategies. She's a former senior trade representative for China at the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative under Presidents Biden and Trump, and a former minister counselor for trade affairs at the U.S. Embassy in Beijing. Stephen Vaughn is a partner in the international trade practice at King & Spalding and a former general counsel in the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative during the first Trump administration. Peter Harrell, I know you're there in the background. If you can turn on your camera. Peter is a visiting scholar at Georgetown's Institute for International Economic Law. He's a former senior director for international economics at the White House under President Biden and a former deputy assistant secretary of the Treasury for counter-threat finance and sanctions under President Obama. And our moderator, who needs no introduction, Ambassador Susan Schwab. She's a strategic advisor at Mayor Brown and a former United States trade representative under President George W. Bush. We can't think of 4 better people to give us a sense of where things are in this very fast-changing environment and where things may be headed in the second year and the remainder of the Trump administration. And as I'd like to note, we are recording and broadcasting today's session at 1:08 p.m. on Monday, February 23rd. As we say on our webinars, what we say today may change by the time we're done with this webinar. We're delighted to have you today. Thank you for joining us. And Susan, take it from here.
Ken, thank you very much. I'm delighted to be joining you and the and our WIDA audience, and obviously this terrific panel. Let's get going here. This is a billed as a Trump 2.0 panel, but given the events of the last couple of days, we can't really start without having a conversation about the IEPA decision by the Supreme Court on Friday. Now, I'm going to assume that this is a WIDA audience that is trade savvy, and we're going to skip all the introductory stuff about what happened. I'm going to assume everyone knows that the 10% tariff on Section 122 tariff on Friday is now a 15% tariff, that you probably are aware of the things that Ambassador Greer talked about over the weekend, or certainly looked at the USTR press release that came out on Friday. If not, you should take a look at it. Same thing, I would commend anybody who hasn't didn't actually watch or hasn't streamed the WIDA emergency webinar on Friday after the Supreme Court decision. I would recommend that you take a look at that. Peter was a part of that program as well. So I'm going to start with a couple of post IEPA trade policy questions, and then we'll get to the post IEPA trade policy status and situation. I'm going to start with you, Stephen. Obviously, the big, or one of the really big questions facing probably a fair number of folks and countries represented in the audience is what happens to the agreements that were negotiated under IEPA, the tariffs and tariff threats. Are we safe? Are we safe in assuming that the revenue-raising measures will continue to be a focus of the administration and as it goes forward, because that clearly was a focus in the use of IEPA. So if you could start with that, because then the obvious question that will follow is, absent congressional approval, how does the administration lock in those agreements?
Yeah, so I think it's important to begin with the assumption that the administration, as of Thursday, they were quite happy with where everything stood, right? They liked the tariffs that they had, they liked the deals that they had, and they wanted to preserve that. So I think everything they're going to try to do over the next few months is going to be to sort of basically maintain as much of that situation as they can. And so I think you're going to see them reaching out. They're already reaching out to the partners who they did the deals with. My guess is, and you've been in these negotiations, you know better than I do. My guess is in every one of the negotiations, there was talk about what will happen if you guys lose the cases. So I don't think any of the trading partners were surprised by that. I think they all understood this was something that could happen. I think they were all prepared for the likelihood that the president will just use another statutory authority. So I don't think anybody's going to be really too surprised by any of this. Obviously, USTR has to do its part. You can't collect a tariff just because another country agreed to the tariff. There has to be a statutory authority here in the United States. And I think what they'll try to do is to get these various 301 investigations completed as quickly as possible so that they can basically get everybody back to the status quo. And their pitch to the other countries would be, you already agreed to that, so whether we do it under this statute or under that statute, it shouldn't make that much of a difference to you.
Makes sense. Peter, do you want to add something here?
Yeah, look, I think most of our trade partner countries are going to continue to work to implement the deals. I think they are tracking. And, I've talked over the last many months to various of the trade deal partner countries. And they had all said in those discussions kind of informally, look, we understand if the IEPA tariffs get overturned, the president is going to have other authorities to recreate at least a good share, if not all of the tariffs. So I think most countries are going to want to, by and large, stick to it. It has been interesting to me to see, but I think the other countries sticking to it sticking to these deals is predicated on the U.S. also sticking to these deals, right? I think they are expecting the Trump administration not to use the IEPA tariff loss and the reconstruction of tariffs under other authorities as a reason to go higher, right? So I think Japan, South Korea, Europe, if the US side of the deal stays at 15 or lower, is going to want to stick with it. If Trump decides maybe actually we want to increase rates a little bit now, then I don't think they're going to feel obliged to stick to the deals.
Makes sense. What about countries? What about countries that thought they had 10%, or countries that basically have been open to the U.S. exports through free trade agreements, or just because they're open trade countries? What happens with them, do you think? Anyone?
Obviously, the president initial announcement was 10%. Then the president said over the weekend he was going to go to 15. So we'll have to kind of wait and see. The executive order that they put out on Friday was still at 10%. I do think under Section 122, it's hard to kind of pick and choose among countries. If the president chooses to stick to 15%, I think you'll see USTR make a real effort to outreach to the UK and any other country that's at that 10% level, which are basically the countries that have where the US has a trade surplus, and try to redress that as quickly as possible through the 301 process.
Okay, that makes sense. Okay, going to the 301 process. If you looked at the USTR press release on Friday and Ambassador Greer's comments over the weekend, clearly the response is going to be heavily 301 focused. And interestingly, not so much, doesn't sound so much like country specific, but rather practice specific. Reference Jameson specific, referenced overcapacity, for example. USTR's press release lists a number of practices. Can we assume that that's sort of going to be the leading edge of USTR's approach to capture, let's say, the maximum number of countries or unfair practices in the effort to reconstruct the tariffs behind the original IEEPA deals? Sara, do you want to go after what kind of 301s can we expect going forward?
Yeah, sure. So, Ambassador Greer put out a statement, and he also said this over the weekend, that they are intending to pursue these 301s, including on hitting multiple countries at one time. I was very encouraged, frankly, to see in the statement references to some of the longstanding issues that many folks at USTR have been working on for a long time. For example, excess capacity, like you mentioned, forced labor. These are issues that are not new to USTR. And in fact, even under the prior administration, there had been work done to look at these issues. And so they're not starting from scratch on these topics. They'll be able to pick them up pretty quickly. And Ambassador Greer has said that the intention is to move on accelerated. So I think that they'll be able to do that. I also just want to mention that both of those issues, excess capacity and forced labor, both of those issues have a strong bipartisan consensus behind them. I think there's something going on here that's important to point out, which is that if we want these 301s to be durable, having them be issues where there is stakeholder buy-in and bipartisan consensus is more likely to lead to a durable 301. And as we saw with the first 301 during the first Trump administration, which I worked on very happily with Stephen, that 301 has been remarkably durable because the process itself was very well done, if I may say so, and the issues have strong support. So I think what I saw in that statement was an attempt to go after issues that there will be strong support for and hopefully will be more durable. And the last thing I just want to say on this is that the USTR team is really the best in class, and they are the most professional staff. And having only left there recently, I can say that I see a lot of people questioning whether USTR is up to the task of being able to complete a number of 301s in 5 months. And I would say never bet against the USTR staff. So I think they're on and they're going to do an excellent job.
Well said, Sara. Let me ask Stephen, Peter, do you want to address the question of Section 301s, sector specific, topic specific, practice specific, or even country specific. I'm going to circle back to China, but in the meantime, because we haven't heard a whole lot of country specific ones, and that in a way was what a lot of folks were expecting coming into the Supreme Court decision, but we haven't heard as much about that. Clearly, there's a China 301 case. There's an investigation going on. There's a Brazil investigation. I want to come back to those, but in terms of these practice, sort of generic practice, unfair trade practice, unreasonable discriminatory practices, and so on. Stephen, Peter, you want to join in here?
You've got two technical things that you've got to think through, Susan. First of all, how do you cover the countries that you wanted to cover? And then second of all, how do you show the level of economic harm that you wanted to show in order to justify the tariffs that you want, right? So my guess is, especially with some of the bigger trading partners, we will see country-specific investigations as well, similar to the one they already did on Brazil, because they will want to have additional bases for potential tariffs on those countries. So I do expect that. I think Sara has made a really important point here, which is the process itself and the fact that you, with a lot of these investigations, if they play out the way they normally do, you will be left with a report that will lay out various unfair trading practices in detail. And that will put the administration in a position to say, look, here's the problem that we've got. And so assuming that the other country is not willing to change its positions, I do think this will help make the tariffs more sustainable. I totally agree with Sara on that.
Well, and there are issues like digital services and related taxes that they've already done a whole lot of work on. A lot of these appear in the National Trade Estimate reports. I can see the option of moving these pretty quickly.
Yeah, and I wanted to say, I'm sorry, let me just, I apologize. Let me just say one other thing. I mean, I think Jameson Greer was quite definitive in terms of his statement, and he usually is quite cautious. So I agree with Sara. I think he's got a lot of confidence that they're going to be able to get this done in a timely manner. Sorry about that.
Yep. No, absolutely. Very, very helpful. Thank you. Peter, want to add anything?
Not a lot. I mean, I do think it is important to keep in mind, as Stephen said, and as Sara suggested too, 301 does have both procedural steps that need to be followed, and there are also some substantive requirements in there, that the tariffs be appropriate to the unfair foreign trade practice. And I think that, Jameson, everyone at USTR understands the odds are quite high that whatever they do under 301 is likely to be challenged in court going forward, right? I think there's a lot more appetite for litigation now. And I think they are going to be quite careful in how they and thorough in how they develop these 301s in order to minimize that litigation risk. And so they're going to be thinking through, okay, if we want to maintain a 15% tariff on the EU, because that's what we have as a deal, what's the best way to use a 301 to get there? They're going to be thinking through, if we want to maintain a 10% tariff on a bunch of, small global South countries where we don't have Trump trade deals, what's the best way to use 301 to get there? If we want to maintain a 20% tariff on on Vietnam, what's the best way to get there? And so we're going to see these 301s be rolled out in a way that they are assessing as the best way for them within the confines of the 301 statute to get the outcomes they want.
So here's a fun question. If we're talking about further litigation, and I know we're going to have a panel tomorrow on IEEPA, including a conversation about refunds, because that's obviously on everybody's minds. But if we're talking about litigation going forward, talking about litigation going forward, you've referenced a couple different areas where there could be potential litigation. One, vis-a-vis the new 301 cases and how those play out, the numbers play out on that. There's been some talk in the last couple months about the potential for going after some would argue, questionable use of the Section 232 derivatives, where it's kind of hard to argue that there is a defense related rationale for some of the items showing up on those derivatives list. And then, of course, we are anticipating some litigation when it comes to the refund process. Anyone want to speculate briefly, please, on which of those three areas are going to be most ripe for action, activity, and lucrative for trade lawyers? Noting for the record, I am not a lawyer.
First of all, I'm sure the trade lawyers are going to be motivated only by what's best for their client. So I think that's, I don't think we have to worry too much about that. But look, I think having won this case on the IEEPA tariffs, I think we can expect that the opponents of the president's trade policies will probably sue on 122. I think they'll probably sue on 301, right? The president, he was sued in the last administration on the 232 tariffs. He was sued in the last administration on the 301 tariffs. I think we're going to see more of these lawsuits. So I think those are going to go forward. In terms of the refunds, it'll be interesting to see what the administration does. I know that there are obviously administrative possibilities to where they can try to get ahead of some of these lawsuits and give companies some more certainty in terms of what's coming next on the refunds. And I think there are going to be a lot of people who want them to do that. And so that may end up fending off some potential litigation there. But those are the two areas that I think I would be the most focused on. Thank you.
Anyone else want to add? Okay, let's go on to country-specific 301s. And I will note, speaking of China, there's been some commentary about the president being weakened in his upcoming visit to China because of this IEEPA decision. I don't happen to be of the view that the president has lost any meaningful clout when it comes to trade actions vis-a-vis China with the IEEPA decision. He's got all the tools he needs, from my perspective, to address China trade practices. The question in my mind is he going to use them? And so, Sara, let me turn to you. You spent a chunk of your career in Beijing, representing the United States, and I'd be curious how you see the U.S.-China side of this equation playing out in terms of the post-IEEPA tariff situation, but also, again, the post-IEEPA tariff and trade policy situation on U.S.-China trade relations.
Yeah, there's a million things I could say about this, but just to start with, at 15%, China's effectively down from the 20% that they were at when the presidents met in Busan. And so what we're going to see is that because there's now basically China's on a more level playing field with other trading partners, that's going to create concern among the administration. So I would not be surprised to see if they try to find a way to get China back up to a higher level so that it differentiates from some of the other major trading partners. So that's the first thing. The second thing is I've seen some commentary out there about how without IEEPA, the president is weakened. And as you've said, you think he has the tools. And I'll just remind everyone, Section 301 was very effective during Trump 1.0 with China. And China knows that. I mean, they've lived through that. They lived through that period. Section 301 was very effective at being able, once the investigation and findings and tariffs were in place, the administration was able to move very quickly. So I would challenge the view that 301 is anything but helpful in this situation. In terms of the trip overall and kind of where we are generally, just to step back, and having been very involved in the China negotiations, both in Trump 1.0 and Trump 2.0, there are some very big significant differences in how China is approaching the United States now compared to how things were during the first Trump administration. I mean, the first key thing to point out is that China lived through the first Trump administration and came prepared for Trump 2.0 to fight back. And we've seen that from the beginning, a much more emboldened China willing to go toe-to-toe and in many cases respond asymmetrically. So responding not just with tariffs, but with other non-tariff measures, and to respond disproportionately, responding in significant ways to demonstrate that the United States does not have escalation dominance over China. So that is a feature that is completely different than the first Trump administration when they were just responding tit for tat. Given that dynamic, given that dynamic that China's doing that now, the strategy has to shift essentially and has to take into account a very emboldened China. Another key difference is that during the first Trump administration, there was also, a desire to really export more to China. Phase one, had a number of purchase commitments. In the years since then, China has really doubled down on its self-reliance initiatives. And I think that through successive administrations, there's been an understanding that we're not going to fundamentally change the Chinese economy, and therefore that's not even really a primary goal of negotiations anymore. So Ambassador Greer recently over the weekend said that the main goal of the trip is going to be to maintain stability. And that is actually what they're hoping to get out of the trip, is to have some degree of stability through this period, including seeing China continue to ship rare earths and not impose export restrictions. And I could talk for a long time about this topic, but I just want to say that in 2025, there were many things that happened that were shocks to the trade system. One of the most overlooked shocks is what China did using its choke points on a number of different critical minerals. We are now sort of in a new era where China's dominance in a number of industries is now a real threat in many ways for the US economy, in a way that at one point used to be sort of notional, but now we've seen how that's deployed. And so that's going to be a critical feature for the next few years of this administration.
Thank you, Sara. That's sobering. Peter, Stephen, comments on US-China?
I agree with what Sara said. Generally, I'd make a couple of points. First, it's important to remember, though, that during the first term, right, Susan, there was a widespread belief that we had no leverage on China, that if you put any tariff on China, it wouldn't have any effect. It would only hurt us. The soybean farmers would rise up and bring down the administration. And now the tariffs have been in effect for a long time, and the stock market has adjusted and the businesses have adjusted. And we used to buy something like over $500 billion worth of goods a year from China. And last year it came in at just over $300 billion. So I find what's interesting about this dynamic is that both parties, I think, actually feel that they have the long-term edge. Obviously everybody knows how much confidence China has in its model, but I think the Trump people believe that, the notion that China can just live off of a $1.2 trillion current account surplus with the rest of the world is not realistic. That over time, China is not going to just run into trade barriers from us, but from other people, and that will start to weigh on their system. So in the short run, when both sides think that they're winning, that makes it harder to get deals, right? But it also means that neither side feels like it's backed into the corner and needs to lash out and stir things up. So it wouldn't surprise me if this year remains relatively stable in US-China relations, because I think both sides are pretty comfortable with the status quo.
Thank you, Stephen. Interesting observation. Peter, do you want to add anything?
I'll just add one point to what Sara and Stephen said. One of the interesting things we saw the Trump administration do across a number of its trade negotiations last year was to better integrate trade issues and security issues. So we saw this in the trade deals with Malaysia and Argentina, in the sense of some of the text of the trade deals with Malaysia and Argentina actually commit Malaysia and Argentina and other countries to cooperate with the US on national security issues. We also saw it with respect to China, where the Trump administration was very clearly willing to talk about things like export controls as part of the trade negotiations with China. I'm not saying I agree with the Trump administration's decision to sell or allow the sale of high-end AI chips in exchange for a sort of a cut of the revenue. I'm not sure I think that's good policy. But I actually think that if you want stability in the US-China relationship, the US has to be willing to have an integrated conversation across both the trade file and the national security file, because the Chinese just sit there and think, well, you're only talking to us about trade, and then you come and whack us with a whole bunch of export controls. Like, why are we having this conversation? So I actually think that the way that while disagreeing with some of the specifics of what Trump is doing, I actually think having an integrated conversation is a helpful condition to being able to have a bit of stability in the relationship over the course of this year.
Makes sense. Thank you very much. I am going to ask one more question and then turn to Ken and ask him to bring in questions from the audience that I know are coming in over the chat. And that sort of follows on from what we've just been talking about. Obviously, the Supreme Court decision has created a bit of a bump in the road on the administration pursuing its trade agenda. And we have you can define the trade agenda however you want, and I think Ambassador Greer did a really good job of defining it in his statement on Friday. How do you see this bump in the road, perhaps changing call it the trajectory, the agenda, or perhaps just the pacing, the ability to move ahead with the rest of the agenda during the balance of the administration's term? Anyone?
I think, look, my own view is that they had a pretty good idea that this was coming, right? And I think that they've had a lot of conversations with their trading partners and with everybody, with the Hill, with the trade. I mean, everybody's been asking them for months, like, what are you going to do when the Supreme Court rules? So I don't think this really came as a big shock to the system. I don't think it's going to really change the trajectory all that much. If anything, I think this is ultimately going to be affected by a lot more what's happening in the larger economy and what's happening politically. Than sort of in the trade space. I think everybody in the trade space kind of understands this is the agenda they have. These are the deals they've made. These are the tariffs they're likely to land on. And I think people are mostly used to that. What I saw putting more change on them was like when they started to think the affordability issue was cutting against them, or when they get good economic news and it makes them feel more confident. To me, those are going to be more likely the drivers, as opposed to some of this more technical stuff.
Anyone else? Okay, I'm going to close out with a quick one. Is Congress going to have any role at all in this?
I do want to say on this one, because I think people misunderstand Congress's role. I think Congress has an enormous role. I think this idea that they just sit back and are passive is not correct. I mean, when you sit over there at USTR, you get a blizzard of commentary from Congress, literally every single day. You have members, you have staff, you're going up there, you're being, and you don't get a lot of positive feedback. You get a lot of feedback from the Congress trying to get you. So I think that's going to continue to be their role. I think they will continue. I think, for example, if they think the president's going soft on China, they'll weigh in. If the president's going too hard on this country, that country, they'll weigh in, and their voices will be heard. The president's not going to make them vote on any of the tariffs, but to be honest, Susan, I don't think they want to vote on any of the tariffs. I think they'd much rather just play their role of oversighting and pressing the administration to do what it wants, but their voices will be heard.
Well said. Sara, Peter, anything else before I turn to Ken?
Yeah, well, one thought from me here on this is that in many ways, and we've talked about this for a number of years, is that the trade policy tools that we have, in many ways, they're really outdated and they really need modernization. And there's been a lot of talk about how we need new tools, right? And so what we've seen here is that the president is basically turning to old tools to try to carry out, very complex contemporary issues. And so I think in this moment, there is a good question to ask, what about our existing tools? Do they need to be updated? For example, Section 232, what we're seeing right now under Section 232, as you sort of alluded to, is nothing like we've ever seen before, right? Do we need new tools to deal with the threat of non-market policies and practices from certain countries, right? There's a number of things that Congress could be doing. Will they do it? That's a different question. But I think until we address the fact that a number of our tools are outdated, we're going to continue to see existing tools being stretched and used in ways that go beyond kind of what we've seen before.
Peter, I've got Ken waving at me. Ken's
the boss, so turn to Ken.
No. Peter, please go ahead.
No, I actually don't have anything to add on Congress.
Okay. Okay. Thank you, Ken.
Well, thanks to those who've sent some questions in. We're going to try to group a few of them just so we can get to them. So we only have about 5 minutes left in our session. A couple of questions come on 301, and I just, again, I want to try to group them a little bit here. But in some of the, I always have to be careful how I say it, agreements on reciprocal trade, partners have agreed to address some of the barriers that the U.S. has complained about in the national trade estimates and in other reports. So if they go through an investigation, some of the, on the one hand, they have agreed to address those problems. And there's a consultation requirement in 301. So presumably those things are already being addressed. Of course, the big country that hasn't addressed a lot of those is China. And the president has a meeting with Xi coming up, and we think in April, and there may be others this year. So how will they sort of rationalize? And look, I think we all know that some of this is pretextual, but how are they going to rationalize some of these 301s when the countries that presumably we're going to be investigating have already agreed to address the issues?
Maybe I'll make a quick comment on this. I actually think the 301s on the trade deal countries, the countries that have struck trade deals with Trump, and particularly ones where we have finalized trade deals, is going to be the legally trickiest set of 301s for USTR. Because the whole point of 301, going back to when Congress passed the statute in 74, is country X is doing something unfair or unjustified that burdens U.S. commerce, and you can impose tariffs to respond to that. It was not designed to impose a perpetual tariff on a country. And so I do think there's going to be this question of, if Japan, as part of its trade deal, has agreed to resolve all of the unfair trade practices that we put on the table, like what's the rationale for from a legal perspective for maintaining the 301? Now, USTR is very talented. Jameson's a very talented trade lawyer. I'm not saying that I think the courts will overturn all of this, but I actually think from a legal perspective, that is going to be trickier than having a 301 on some country that is kind of obstreperously refusing to solve all the unfair trade practices.
I think the nice thing about this is, and I think those are all really good points, but I think the nice thing from USTR's perspective is they can say, look, this is the deal, right? This is what you guys agreed to, right? So whether we do the 15% tariffs through IEPA or whether they do the 15% tariffs through 301, it shouldn't make any difference to the foreign country at all. It's the same deal either way. And if they go to court and they say, well, didn't they do what you wanted? You say, yeah, they did do what we wanted. And part of what they did was they agreed to these tariffs. So the tariffs were part of the deal to begin with, right? In other words, we didn't just make an agreement that you guys are going to fix these things. We also made an agreement that you're going to fix all the other things that have led to these sort of never-ending trade balances with us. So I think they're going to be, I think actually when the time comes and they're sort of forced to sort of defend whatever they end up doing, I think it's actually going to make a difference to the court that they can point to these and say, look, these were deals that everybody agreed to.
I think it's a different kind. I mean, quite frankly, I think it's a different kind of Section 301 outcome. I mean, consultations are a part of it. And if you look at outcomes, sometimes you've got tariffs, sometimes you've got agreements, and they'll put all of that together in a package and call it a deal. And if the other country's agreeing to it, who's going to disagree?
I was just looking over my shoulder a minute ago, Susan, for your book Trade-Offs, which I got back there, and thinking about like these persistent trade issues that we've been dealing with since your days in, I want to say the first George H.W. Bush administration. In some cases, some of these trade barriers that we've been dealing with go back that far. And one interesting question, I might wrap with this, I'm just curious what the folks on the call think. Irv Williamson, a former ITC commissioner, had a question about the use of Section 301 to address industrial excess capacity. Is that it's not been done before that way? For that, I'm told, according to Irv's question. Curious if anyone has any thoughts on that, which is certainly the big one of the biggest ones we have with China, of course. Steven? You're muted.
So I mean, look, it's a great question from Commissioner Williams. I was not a surprise to me. I've gotten his questions for many years. I would say that my guess is, and Sara might want to comment on this as well, because she knows USTR is thinking on this very well. I think what they will try to do is say that the excess capacity is the result of various unfair trading practices. Could be subsidies, could be closed markets, could be, using regulations to keep other imports out, whatever it is, that it's when you see excess capacity that sustains itself year after year after year, that doesn't feel like a market-based outcome. So I think that's what they'll probably try to do, and therefore say that the excess capacity, that it's not because this private company did something wrong, it's because the government has acts, policies, or practices that encourage the capacity. And I think that's how they'll try to fit it into the statute.
Thank you, Stephen. If there's not any other, anyone have any final words before we get to our next discussion? Thank you, please, Susan.
The service that you provide to the trade community. Much appreciated. Always.
Thank you. Truly appreciate all of you. We've had you on at different times, many times in some cases over the years, and in our podcast as well. So truly thankful to the four of you for joining us for this intro session to sort of set the table for a lot of what we'll be discussing for the rest of the conference. As I mentioned, we're going to get a lot more into the IEPA ruling and the what might be coming afterwards at our session tomorrow. Thank you very much, guys. Thank you, Stephen, Sara, Susan, and Peter. Look forward to seeing you all again. And as I ask our next panel to please turn on their cameras and join us, I'd like to welcome four more of our conference supporters who are in the audience. Scott Jacobs with Coupang, Beth Hughes with the American Apparel and Footwear Association, John Gold with the National Retail Federation, and Jade Willennon with Trade Data Monitor. Thanks to Coupang, American Apparel and Footwear Association, AAFA, NRF, and Trade Data Monitor for their support for the conference. This year, one of the areas we expect to see a lot of discussion in global trade is on critical minerals. We're pleased to partner with our friends at Silverado Policy Accelerator on a series of events to discuss critical minerals, starting with today's panel, the New Frontier in Critical Minerals Policy, Negotiating Trade Agreements. Thank you to our friend and partner, Manaz Khan, Vice President of Policy and Critical Supply Chains at Silverado Policy Accelerator, and our panelist, Susan Demarjian, Assistant USTR for Small Business, Market Access, and Industrial Competitiveness, Jillian Angenti, Manager, Tax and Trade at Panasonic North America, Del Renegar, Vice President, External Affairs at Rio Tinto, and Alex Stroman, Vice President, Government Relations and Regulatory Affairs at Albemarle Corp. Thank you for joining us today. Manaz?
Thanks, Ken. Thanks for the introduction, and thank you for our panelists for being here today. It's a real pleasure to moderate today's discussion on the new frontier for critical minerals policy, negotiating trade agreements. I don't think there's a day in Washington that goes by without hearing the word critical mineral agreements, whether that's in policy discussions or in the news. So you probably heard topics such as permitting and price floors to partnerships. This issue has quickly moved to the center of policy conversations, both here in DC and abroad. What's interesting now is that until recently, critical minerals really weren't part of the trade policy discussion, but that has now changed with President Trump's Section 232 order that was announced last month. And that order directed USTR and Commerce to move forward on negotiating new trade agreements or advancing existing ones. So we're very happy today to have 4 panelists from the industry and government to kind of break down some of our questions. And the important questions that we have today more broadly are, what would these agreements look like in practice? How do we balance national security with economic competitiveness, especially from the company angle? And how do we design these agreements that are not just strategic for this moment, but durable over the long term? So thank you all. Sushan, I want to start with you on the first question, because there's been a lot of actions that happened over the past month. We saw the Section 232 announcement by the White House, and it's the first time that it directed USTR and Commerce to pursue these critical mineral agreements. Then what we saw on February 4th was a critical minerals ministerial with 55 countries, and that resulted in the announcement of this critical minerals trade bloc and these action plans. So really 2 action plans, one with the EU and Japan, that would be a plurilateral one, and then one with Mexico. So can you just tell us from the USTR perspective a little bit about how all these various initiatives fit together and what role USTR plays?
Sure. Thank you, Manaz, and thank you, Ken and Wita, for having me. It's a very timely topic. As Manaz said, we've been talking about critical minerals in a variety of ways over the last several years, and not just at USTR, but throughout the interagency and in international organizations. So there are many forums in which critical minerals are being discussed, and I think after several years of conversation, we're really at a point where we want to try and find some actions and solutions that we can jointly do among governments and across governments. I think the ministerial that was hosted by the State Department was with a range of countries that have signed cooperative MOUs with the State Department that are really focused more on cooperative activities at potential investments, potential cooperation on research and development. What USTR has been directed to do is to produce an actual legally enforceable trade agreement regarding a price mechanism for critical minerals or select critical minerals to start with among like-minded trading partners that want to assure a minimum market-based price that covers the cost of the production and processing of critical minerals in order to develop our own domestic capabilities for critical minerals. This has stemmed from the longstanding concern that has been expressed during these various conversations on critical minerals that the concentration of critical minerals is now so heavily in China, and the ability of China's non-market policies and practices to affect the pricing in unfair ways in terms of both price volatility and just prices that are below the cost of production, make it very difficult for domestic industries in market-oriented economies to get the private financing and the off-take agreements that are needed to support a processing capability domestically. So the purpose of working on a critical minerals agreement is to find a way to create a price mechanism that supports that domestic production and supply chain, and then to use border measures to enforce it among the like-minded trading partners. So that's a very specific objective that USTR has and that we're working on. The action plans are essentially sort of preliminary agreements on how we're going to cooperate with interested trading partners in actualizing that agreement, which we are in the process of developing. And I'll just add at the outset, because this is probably of interest to everyone listening now, we are about to release a Federal Register notice asking for public comment specifically on this critical minerals agreement. And I believe it is anticipated to be published this week. So we encourage all interested stakeholders across the supply chain, as well as downstream users of critical minerals, to provide feedback to that Federal Register notice, because it will inform us as we move forward with the critical minerals agreement. So I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you, Sushan. I have heard that rumor about the comment period on this. Real quick question on the comment period, because every mineral is so different when it comes to price stabilization and price floors. Are you guys looking mineral by mineral, or is that still like open to negotiation as a result of this comment period?
Well, I think we're looking for a lot of information. Obviously, you know, our internal U.S. government process led by the Department of Interior and USGS has identified 60 critical minerals. And we know that each of these has some downstream processed products that are really what's traded. And we are not going to be doing a critical minerals agreement that covers everything all at once. So I think what we'll be looking for is like priority minerals where the market conditions and other elements make these minerals most favorable for a price mechanism to stabilize the price and support processing. And of course, if we are going to have more than one participant, then there will have to be some agreement among the partners of which are the ones we want to focus on at the outset. Presumably, as this process advances, we can continue to analyze more and more minerals and add price mechanisms to those as well.
Thank you, Sushan. And I forgot to mention, if you have any questions as we proceed, please feel free to put it in the chat. Del, I want to go to you next to get the company perspective. Rio Tinto has a diverse American and international footprint. You have facilities, Kennecott in Utah, the boron operation in California, copper assets in Arizona, and internationally, like gallium production in Canada, and significant critical mineral assets in Australia. So from your position, you're looking at this from a global footprint. So my question for you is, as the U.S. advances these critical mineral agreements and action plans that Sushan talked about under the 232, what are the opportunities and potential challenges for global companies such as yours?
Yeah. Thanks, Manaz. It's great to be here with you and Wida, and really thanks to everyone for the focus on critical minerals. Manaz in particular has done a fantastic job in elevating the profile of this issue. And really thanks to Sushan and the Trump administration for rightfully making this such a huge priority. For Rio Tinto, I begin with the fact that we are a Five Eyes mining company. Our significant operations are in those Five Eyes countries. And the reason why I focus on that is because in my experience, you really can't focus on 55 priorities across 55 materials across 55 countries. So for us, we really try to focus on working most closely, most deeply with the trusted partners where we have established relationships. And I think that also has to be true in the trade space. First and foremost, that means Canada. Canada is an arsenal of democracy. It has been since the World Wars, and we ought to be treating Canada as such by treating them like the critical and essential partner that they are. And in my opinion, that means renewing and stabilizing USMCA and rationalizing these 232s, because on so many of these issues, Canada really is our partner of choice and our most critical partner. It also means, for me, Japan. Anyone who's worked on putting together project development, worked on financing, worked on development financing, the Japanese government, the Japanese trade houses, the Japanese companies are truly excellent in this kind of work. And they can play a huge role in the midstream and processing space, where I think we need a lot of global partnerships and a lot of assistance around the world. And certainly no one has more to lose in all of this than Japan. I also would call out Argentina. President Milei has done an incredible job of protecting investment, putting mining projects under the protection of his RIGI investment scheme, as well as making a number of significant commitments to the U.S. in terms of keeping the mining sector open to U.S. and Western companies so that they can compete fairly against China and other players. With respect to the challenges, We still have huge skill capacity workforce development challenges here. We don't have in the West the kind of technology or mining engineers or training or even safety practices that we need to really do this well. That's an area that we all have to focus on. Infrastructure, of course, we need energy, we need ports, we need rail, we need shipping. And also, for mining companies, this is the hardest work I've ever done. As many of you know, I spent most of my life at GE. I thought that was hard. Trying to get a social license to work with these countries, to work with these communities, and to do it on really a cradle to grave basis is incredibly difficult. And we're going to continue to need government support, community support, so that we can work with these communities responsibly.
Great outline, Del. You mentioned Canada. What would you like to see? What kind of engagement would you like to see there? Would it be under USMCA, bilaterally, an MOU? I'm curious, or you can let that one rest a bit. But
Yeah,
after
I take that one back to USTR. I would say I think we need to stop the noise and clean up the mess quickly, and then move on to a proper and hopefully speedy USMCA process.
Thank you so much. I'll circle back with you. Alex, you're the other miner and producer in this area, and one for a mineral that's very challenging, especially on the price side. And so I want to ask you, because lithium prices have been under sustained pressure for a while, and producers like Albemarle, both the United States and globally, have faced a lot of these type of challenges. When the US, USTR, and Commerce are looking to make these critical mineral agreements, what do you need to see in those agreements to support long-term investment specifically in domestic lithium production? And are there other trade tools like stronger enforcement or traceability that could level the playing field? I know at Silverado we have really pushed for, the UFLPA or forced labor provisions in this field. So curious to get your thoughts, because it's hard to compete with China on lithium prices nowadays.
Well, thanks so much for having me, and to my fellow panelists. It's already been a very interesting conversation, discussion. Manaz, I'll start by saying I'm not a technical expert on traceability systems. My lens is a little bit more about how lithium projects get funded and how we get to the pricing and the processing side. As you know, and as we've definitely seen over the past couple of years, lithium is naturally cyclical. So what's challenging right now is the scale of price volatility, which is then layered on top of that global cyclical oversupply. So when prices move 60 to 70% within a year, that creates real financing constraints. So boards hesitate, lenders pull back, capital just becomes much more expensive. And so I would say this probably isn't really about any country, but it's about whether global markets are operating on transparent, rules-based terms, and whether they allow for sustained investment in projects. Enforcement and traceability, they absolutely matter for market integrity, but they don't really solve that volatility issue. Even in a perfectly enforced system, extreme price swings can prevent projects from moving forward, as we've seen. If we're serious about creating more domestic production, I think we really need to think about the mechanisms that can reduce that extreme downside risk and improve investment certainty. There are proposals under discussion in policy circles, in addition to what USTR is doing, concepts like Project Vault, Secure Minerals Act that we're closely following, that explore the strategic demand backstops, reserve mechanisms, price smoothing structures. Those concepts, though, I think have to be about the resilience of the market and to Dell's point, not exclusion. The objective isn't to override the markets, it's to mitigate these extreme downturns that make investment decisions nearly impossible. So if designed carefully, if they're targeted, if they're transparent, coordinated across major market economies, those tools can actually reinforce market confidence without distorting really the long-term signals. Because the battery value chain spans multiple continents, extraction, refining, cathode production, cell manufacturing, any stabilization approach really has to be coordinated. These unilateral measures, they risk fragmentation. We're proud to be a company here in the United States that operates globally. Our interests really are in these predictable, transparent systems that can reduce that volatility and support long-term supply chain resilience across all the jurisdictions in which we operate.
Alex, is there one or two that like price floors, contract for differences, a tariff wall, or is there any that you like better than others for the lithium industry, or that you're pushing for more than others?
So
Just a general concept.
yeah, so we're more in a monitoring phase and seeing how things shape up when it comes to Albemarle. Obviously, like I said, the biggest issue really here is that volatility. And so as Congress, as administration really looks at, like I mentioned, Project Vault, Secure Minerals Act, really looking for tools that can make sure that the market is smooth, that we can lose some of the volatility that we've seen in the lithium space. And really, you know, I think it's no one solution, but I think that all of the tools that are being considered really can try and help the market and allow companies to be able to invest.
That's great. Thank you so much. I want to move it to Jillian. Jillian, you're one off taker on the panel, and really looking forward to getting your demand side perspective, which is just as important as the supply side that Dell and Alex talked about. For off takers, what I hear is the biggest concern in this space is stability, both in terms of the physical supply, but the price volatility of critical minerals. So I know Panasonic is making major long-term investments in the US battery supply chain. You have a joint operation with Tesla at Gigafactory Nevada, and also a new large-scale EV plant in Kansas. So given that level of capital commitment that your company and others have made in this space, what would you like to see in these emerging critical mineral trade agreements to ensure reliable supply and price stability for these facilities that you've invested in over the long term?
Yeah, thank you for the great question. And also thank you to Wida for having me today. I mean, you kind of hit on my answer in your question, which is we're really interested in stable supply and being able to promote that in the US market. And so to that end, the two pieces that we really emphasize is prioritizing scaling and processing capability in the US too, as opposed to just a focus on mining. As you mentioned, we're one of the largest, if not the largest, US battery manufacturers, which does make us uniquely positioned to kind of have a different perspective on the state of the US critical minerals mining and processing landscape. And honestly, on the ground, one of the biggest issues we see is quality gaps, and then new companies kind of overcoming scalability problems. Often we are able to qualify samples from suppliers, but there is a major difference between being able to produce a qualified sample in the US and being able to provide at the gigafactory level, as you mentioned. That's not just one qualified sample, that is, you know, hundreds and hundreds of batches to kind of meet the demand that a gigafactory needs to sustain and keep all of our lines running at once. We're currently rolling 70 batteries a second off of our line. So, you know, getting new entrants into the market from sampling to scale is a huge hurdle that the US market needs to kind of grapple with overcoming. I'd also emphasize that because we're making batteries for mobility EV applications, consumer safety is a huge concern, which means that our standards are really high for qualifying new suppliers. And that takes, you know, a lot of technical integration between manufacturer and supplier to make sure that the product that we're buying for applications to go into cars that, you know, I drive my family around in every day and need to feel very confident that these are safe products. The standards are just really high. And that is just not a process that can happen overnight. It's not a process that can happen in 6 months. It often takes us years to kind of get our suppliers to a place that we can comfortably purchase at scale to supply our factories. So those two pieces, kind of the technical and the scalability phase, are things that we would love to see policymakers emphasize in these agreements to kind of move domestic manufacturers from the startup phase to the scale phase, which can be a significant hurdle for suppliers that Panasonic is looking to onboard.
Thanks, Jillian. I did have a follow-up question because, you know, I know you have a lot of facilities in Japan, and specifically on this US, EU, Japan action plan. What role could a stronger coordination between these three countries play in reinforcing these trusted supply networks, especially for a company like Panasonic, and making sure there's reliable access to critical minerals? We also have a framework deal with Japan where there's like a stockpiling mechanism built in there as well. So, you know, wanted to get your thoughts on that kind of, this is the first time we're seeing like a trilateral action plan.
Yeah, I think it's a huge opportunity. And I think something that Panasonic, as a company that's been manufacturing batteries in Japan for decades, really gets right is extremely close technical relationships between supplier and manufacturer. It's something that kind of looks like vertical integration, but isn't exactly vertical integration. But there's a massive opportunity because industry is so kind of nascent in the US for the government to promote those kinds of close relationships that allow for seamless supply without supply gaps and kind of will insulate the domestic market from like the weaponization that some other actors in the world sometimes make in terms of critical mineral supply. So if we can use the plurilateral relationship to link suppliers and manufacturers very close together, that allows us to prevent supply disruptions. And as innovation happens, we're tinkering with our battery supply, our battery technology all the time to remain on the cutting edge. And so those close relationships allow us to continue to innovate and allow our suppliers to continue to evolve with us. And that closeness builds resilience into the system. So to the extent that the US, EU, and Japan can promote that collaboration, I think that could be a massive opportunity as we kind of build, the critical minerals club between the three groups.
Yep. Manaz, if I could, one important piece of all this I want to emphasize is the R&D and technology piece. So you can't just pull these materials out of the air or pull them out of the ground. There's extensive flow sheets and mapping that has to be done. It requires significant technical expertise that, again, we don't necessarily have in the United States. For us, a lot of that is in Australia and Canada. And so we get back into issues around movement of people. We get back into issues of proper and reasonable export controls, gets into IP protection. As well as keeping our agreements with AUKUS and the US-UK agreement and our tools like XIM and DPA and all these other things on tap and ready to move. So I think as we're thinking about these agreements, we also have to have in mind the entire ecosystem that allows us to have the technology collaboration that we need and the funding.
That's great. Thank you. Let's see. Company representatives. How have critical mineral focus MOUs, the framework agreements, and these reciprocal trade agreements addressed mineral recycling and broader resource efficiency? If so, how might partners best move forward on advancing meaningful collaboration on the recycling and resource efficiency fronts within these agreements? And actually, happy to have anybody step in.
Well, I'll start. I would say I think recycling is super important, and I think honestly that's something that the U.S. needs to get right, more so than our partners necessarily. So there's a lot that we could be doing with scrap and recycling in the U.S. We tend to have a patchwork across our states that doesn't really work, and we are exporting a lot of material to China that then gets recycled in China and comes back into the United States. So I really think the U.S. has to get its own act together on these issues. I would say with respect to energy and some of the other pieces, everything that Rio Tinto does is focused on having as little water use as possible, because we do tend to operate in places like Chile and Utah and Arizona where water is precious. And so I think there are a lot of industry standards around water that have to be looked at and included aspirationally for some of this work. And then finally, our customers demand that we use clean power wherever possible. And so continuing to look for those opportunities in solar and wind and even potentially SMRs is definitely something that we need to continue to work on that broader ecosystem that I was mentioning.
Yeah, that doesn't get talked about as much in the critical minerals. I think it's very mining and processing focused that we forget about the water and the power that you need for these minerals. Our second question, Sushan, this is for you. Is USTR working with all 54 countries that joined the State Department ministerial on a price floor agreement?
Thanks. Let me just go back to the previous question with regard to recycling and environmental considerations. I think that will be part of the conversation in developing the critical minerals agreement. First, to ensure that the partners in the agreement have access to scrap and recyclable material, because we know that is also an important part of our diversity and security of our critical mineral supply chain. So that will certainly be an element that we will discuss. And again, this is all news, so I'm not exactly sure how it will be incorporated yet, but it is certainly something we are looking at, as well as how to apply high standards for labor and environment enforcement as well, because one of the challenges with regard to global pricing of critical minerals among other types of commodities is the fact that other locations have low environmental and labor standards and regulation, and what Ambassador Greer refers to as labor and environmental or regulatory arbitrage, and it allows for their cost structures to be just significantly lower than ours, and that is something that we have to also consider in the pricing mechanism that we will be developing and the border measures that we use to apply it. With regard to the countries that signed the various MOUs with the State Department, I don't know that we'll be going out to all of them all at the same time. I think Japan, the EU, and Mexico represent perhaps the first countries that have expressed an interest to work with us towards developing a critical minerals agreement. And so we will be potentially starting with them. Obviously, a critical minerals agreement is a much higher level of commitment than an MOU. And once we have all of the elements of this agreement together, I think countries will have to assess whether they are prepared to join on the terms that we will be developing.
And Sushan, but those action plans are tailored for either plurilaterally or bilaterally for each country, right? Or you get
right. The action plans are sort of a preliminary step to indicate, sort of the scope of the work that the governments intend to do with us. The actual commitment will be in the critical minerals agreement that we develop with those partners.
Thank you. We had another question here, wondering what type of forced labor provisions will be in these type of agreements, and also would love the company perspective on this, on what companies want to see on the labor standards piece, not just with respect to forced labor, but other type of provisions.
Well, I'm happy to speak for Albemarle here, and obviously we're fundamentally a values-led company. And so we're leader in responsible mining practices. For instance, wherever we operate, we make sure that we have strong labor standards. We've completed the initiative for responsible mining assurance standard for responsible mining at our lithium site in the Salar de Atacama in Chile. And I think that from a policy perspective, enforcement and traceability standards are important. They improve the transparency and help ensure that responsible producers aren't disadvantaged. But it's also to be important, to be realistic, if you will, about global supply dynamics. When it comes to lithium, most of the global lithium production today is compliant with international labor standards. So when we think about enforcement tools, they do strengthen confidence and they do level the playing field, but they're unlikely on their own to fundamentally reshape global market structure. And so if you think about where the standards are applied, and if they're applied across the globe consistently, that does enhance that transparency without fragmenting the supply chains. When it comes to batteries, the battery value chain today, as Jillian was saying, is heavily concentrated in Asia. So that's where much of the downstream processing and manufacturing capacity resides. We operate in that global ecosystem and we compete in it too. So I would say for us, our focus is aligning those standards across jurisdiction, reinforcing responsible production, and then pairing enforcement measures with broader tools that address, as I spoke about earlier, the volatility and structural imbalances. But ultimately, responsible sourcing, market stability, and global coordination need to work together if we want to have a predictable and investable system.
Del, did you have thoughts?
I would just say, in this space, Manaz, I think labor unions play a key role. Obviously, there are groups like the steel workers and others who work in the US and Canada and also work with international labor partners globally. I think in many instances, we're better off listening to the labor unions who want to see projects develop, who want to keep their workers safe, and less so on some of the NGOs who may try to use these issues to slow things down or divide and conquer. But fundamentally, worker safety, worker skills, and treating people with respect is all part of the social license that we need if we're actually going to advance these projects.
And Doug, you mentioned social license before. Can you explain what that is? I don't think that's a term that folks know very well in the trade policy space.
I think it means being a good local corporate citizen. People have a lot of connection to land and resources that's different, and often you're operating in spaces with indigenous communities that have been disadvantaged, communities that may have a lot of poverty and a lot of high unemployment rates, often in very remote and difficult parts. That's unfortunately where we seem to put the minerals and the materials from our creator, whoever that might be. And so really having proactive, meaningful engagement and opportunities with those local communities is how you can ensure that you're able to produce these materials responsibly and efficiently. And if you don't get that social license to operate in that local community, it's going to be very difficult to advance these projects.
Thank you. I did have a question for the companies. USTR is negotiating both plurilaterally and bilaterally. I don't know if you all had a preference on how USTR should be negotiating these agreements, especially with this critical minerals ministerial, where they wanted to create a trading bloc. Would that be a better approach, or would tailored bilateral agreements, especially in countries that you operate in, be a better approach in this situation, or should USTR do both?
Well, I think if the objective is to create a pricing system and a market system that allows you to compete fairly and transparently, you have to have as broad a partnership as possible. So I think on certain things, to create that dynamic, you need as many partners as possible so that you're able to create the level of demand and demand signals and supply that is actually meaningful. But certainly with certain individual countries, I think it also makes sense to do bilateral. So I guess my answer is both, all of the above.
I think your preference is Five Eyes, right, on the plurilateral? Makes sense. Alex or Jillian, did you have an opinion on that?
Yeah, I'll try to just chime in quickly. I think I agree. I'd also say whatever. I think I'm format agnostic as long as it's a durable, substantive agreement that the bodies can come to. I think that it would be our preference. So whatever form or fashion that takes, we welcome it.
Alex, any opinions?
Ditto there.
Sushan, there are a number of companies that are on this call. I think one question I have for you, what kind of information, usually in the critical mineral space, when we think of agencies that are leading on this, we think of, the National Energy Dominance Council, National Security Council, State Department, Department of Energy. USTR is not usually the first one on the list, even though the order has changed that. What kind of information do you need specifically from companies to help you better negotiate these type of agreements or action plans? I think that the comment period will allow for that, but if companies are coming to you and engaging one-on-one, what kind of information are you looking for in your team as well?
Thank you. And yes, when this Federal Register notice comes out, it actually is going to have quite a lot of questions because this is really a very novel approach for trade agreements for USTR, and we want to get as much information as we can so we can, work with our partners to actually develop a format for pricing and border adjustment that is workable. And I think we want to understand pricing and markets, and really to get feedback from the industry, the whole supply chain down to the consumer element of it, such as Panasonic, to really understand where the price intervention could actually have an impact on supporting investment and production among the partners. We recognize that each critical mineral has its own properties, its own way of being extracted and processed and used. And we have a lot of data, but there's also a sort of a more qualitative aspect to this analysis, to understanding, what is the product that's being traded, where in the supply chain does the pricing make a difference, and where do we want to put our efforts to support what would be viable and commercially viable and actually essentially physically viable production among the partners. So that will come out in the Federal Register notice. And as well as other considerations that we need to think of. These are, sort of unusual commodities for us to really be focused on. Usually we deal with much bigger commodities when we're doing trade agreements, not things down to that are traded in the hundreds of tons or thousands of tons as opposed to millions. So we really want to get the kind of feedback that will support our objectives. And in particular, again, with regard to the pricing aspect, as well as the effective types of border measures that could sustain that price among the participating members of the agreement.
Thanks, Sushan. We got a question here. For how long will the Federal Register notice be available for comment?
I'm not exactly sure, but I suspect it'll be less than 30 days, but not as short as just 2 weeks. So I would say start thinking now, so that don't wait to read it. It's supposed to be coming out this week. So I know that there's been a lot of thinking going on among organizations and companies, because this is not a new topic in Washington or around the globe. So to focus again on the specific thing that we're doing, which is a price mechanism-based agreement with border measures to enforce the price. And any specific information that stakeholders wish to provide, we'll be very interested to see. There will be an opportunity for submitting business confidential information as well.
Thanks, Sushan. We've been writing our comments earlier in great anticipation. So good to hear it'll be longer than 2 weeks. We had another question here for Sushan. Can you explain border adjustment? What do you mean by that term?
So if you are going to set a price that you want to have in your market for any one of these critical mineral products, there's got to be a way to ensure that that price is applicable to imports as well. So there are various ways to do that. You could use tariffs. You could use, some type of price band top up. You could do import licenses and tariff rate quotas. So these are, just off the top of our heads, the kinds of things that you would be doing to ensure that an imported critical mineral is competing on the same price level as the domestically produced critical mineral, with the price floor that's been established by the agreement partners.
And a related question we got on that point, would these price floors or other mechanisms, would they need to be variable or fixed? There's so much volatility in this industry.
Well, I think that's going to be part of the conversation. It's going to depend on the critical minerals that we choose to work with. I think that's going to be part of the question is, questions in the in the Federal Register notice, which critical minerals appear or, would be the most viable for this type of an arrangement. They've got to be ones that have, are meaningful for, I'm just, going to guess, meaningful across a broader range of industries that are, that can be supported through a price mechanism, as opposed to any other approach. So a lot is going to depend on the minerals that are chosen for the agreement, or at least for the start of the agreement, and then each one of them we recognize is going to be slightly different, and there could potentially be different mechanisms for different minerals. So that's all part of what is going to have to be worked out. We're still at the very early conceptual stages of this. We were only given this instruction a month ago. So there's a lot to work out, which is why we're doing the Federal Register notice.
If I could, Manaz, just on that point, I think the U.S. government has something they call a chiclets chart. It's all these little bands of red, yellow, green that is obviously sensitive and at this point, I assume confidential information. But one of the challenges here is really understanding where the demand signals are coming from and aggregating those demand signals so that companies have a better idea of where they could add the most value in terms of producing materials or trying to trade to get those materials. And hopefully we can come to some alignment on that. I understand there's sensitivity perhaps in sharing that information because it does expose vulnerabilities. But as a practical matter, I think there's a lot more the private sector could do if we had better visibility as to what those demand signals were and where the most important needs were across that so-called chiclets chart.
That's great. Thank you, Del. So this is just the beginning of the critical minerals trade policy discussion. We will be doing a lot more with WIDA on this front. So I want to thank our panelists, give them a virtual round of applause for joining us today, and looking forward to engaging further on this issue. So back to you, Ken.
Thanks so much. Really appreciate it, Manaz, Jillian, Sushan, Del, and really grateful for you guys for joining us for this session. There's so much to talk about. And really, this is just the start, as you said, Alex as well. Didn't mean to neglect to mention you. So thanks. There's, like I said, lots to talk about. We're going to be doing that, more of these sessions in the coming months. And as I ask our next panel to please turn on their cameras, I want to welcome some of our USMCA review series sponsors who are in the audience: Amanda Farrell and Maggie Ambrose at General Motors, Jennifer Safavian and Rory Heslington with Autos Drive America, Alejandra Castillo with the North American Grain Export Association, and Christy Goodfellow with the Corn Refiners Association. Both North American Grain Exports Association and corn refiners are sponsors of both our USMCA series and this conference. So thank you very much. And thanks as well to GM and Autos Drive America. Our next panel, there's certainly a lot of uncertainty about what we might expect in trade in 2026. But the review of the US-Mexico-Canada agreement and any renegotiations that may take place has been the biggest trade issue we've all known is coming this year, and will be a key focus for the U.S. government and for WIDA, and we'll be talking about with our USMCA review series this year. As I briefly introduce our panel, a reminder that their full biographies are in our event program that we sent around earlier today. Welcome to Jordan Dickinson, who's Director of Government Relations at Target, another sponsor of our USMCA review series. Nassim Fussell is Vice President, Trade and International at the Business Roundtable, also a sponsor of our USMCA review series. Brad Wood is a Senior Director for Trade and Innovation Policy at the National Foreign Trade Council. Maria Ziba is a Vice President of Government Affairs at the National Pork Producers Council and one of our conference sponsors. And Matt Blunt is President of the American Automotive Policy Council. Thank you for joining us. And of course, our moderator, Greta Peisch, is a partner at Wiley Ryan. And Greta was a trade counsel on the Senate Finance Committee during negotiation and consideration of USMCA. during Trump 1 and oversaw key implementation issues as general counsel at USTR under President Biden. So we have a ton of experience, a ton of perspective for this panel, and really thrilled to have you all with us today. Greta, I don't hear you yet. You want to check your mic?
How's this one? Great.
You're good. Thanks so much, Greta.
Now that we have the technical difficulties, knock on wood, covered, thank you for inviting me to moderate, and thanks to all the wonderful panelists, which bring a really broad perspective to this topic. And with that, we'll jump in. I'll maybe just say a couple words just to situate where we are in the process, because it feels like we've been talking about USMCA review for a while now. This is a novel mechanism in the agreement that on the 6th anniversary, the parties undertake a joint review of the operation of the agreement. And as part of that review, they can recommend actions to make improvements, and also need to confirm whether they want the agreement to continue. That even failing to confirm their desire to continue the agreement doesn't terminate under the mechanism. It just means you keep talking and reviewing the agreement for up to another 10 years. And that's kind of the interesting structure of this mechanism. Also, we have, through the USMCA Implementation Act, domestic procedures to review the agreement. So USTR has taken public comment, has held a public hearing, has reported to Congress about the operation of the agreement, has taken an input from the trade advisory committees. And right now we're in that period where a lot of that process, the domestic process, has been completed, and presumably USTR is taking it in to come up with its recommendations for that joint review process. So it's really timely to get the reactions from the panelists now about not only that process so far, but also the bigger picture of USMCA and its performance and U.S. business priorities, as the panel title indicates. So with that sort of brief intro, I want to dive right in to that bigger picture question. I'd love to get the perspectives across the panel on the performance of USMCA. What are the assessments from your company or sector's specific vantage point of the performance today? How do you assess that? Has it lived up to the expectations in the business community for that performance, or the standards set in the first Trump administration, in part to help bring more jobs, manufacturing jobs, back to the United States, to help businesses, U.S. businesses, thrive in the region? What has been successful? What is not? We always have lessons learned from the negotiations, things we wish we would have gotten or nailed down a little bit better. So anything kind of in that bucket, I'd love to hear perspectives. And so maybe let's first go to Naseem, if you'd like to share your overarching views there.
Thank you, Greta. Thank you to WIDA for hosting this fantastic event annually and for bringing us together today. I will just say on behalf of Business Roundtable that USMCA has been a great success. Going back to the NAFTA renegotiation, the Business Roundtable was incredibly supportive and believed that President Trump secured important new commitments in USMCA that absolutely do protect American jobs, that focus on strengthened domestic manufacturing and have done so, and ultimately grow the U.S. economy. I'd like to focus on several key areas where there were significant improvements and a great deal of focus back then that we have seen positive developments. So I'll start with digital trade. USMCA is the gold standard for digital trade commitments. And I think some of the activity we've seen around the world since USMCA was negotiated have really brought us back over and over again to these being the gold standard commitments that we have in USMCA that we would ideally like to see more broadly around the world. And so this has been a real positive area. There were also important commitments made in the areas of financial services. These are commitments that promote market access and place limitations on local data storage requirements. There were strong intellectual property commitments that were made, providing new authorities for officials to combat piracy and counterfeits, and more broadly establish protections for trade secret theft, and importantly, including against state-owned enterprises. There were strong telecommunication services commitments made, strong commitments on technical barriers to trade, other sectoral commitments, strong agricultural market access commitments, and very importantly, strong auto rules of origin intended to prevent non-parties from enjoying USMCA market access benefits, and energy commitments. Now, these are, notwithstanding, of course, areas of improvement and room for growth across all of these points that I just shared that were key areas of improvement from NAFTA to USMCA. These are nonetheless delivering significant benefits for the US economy. A few stats, if I may, to demonstrate this. Today, trade with Canada and Mexico supports 13 million American jobs. Since USMCA entered into force, Canada and Mexico have invested $775 billion in the United States. There's been a 50% increase in two-way trade, and a quarter of total US trade comes from Canada and Mexico. Importantly, this is larger than any other trading bloc. And finally, since USMCA was implemented, real GDP in North America has grown. All three economies have grown, but the United States has grown the most. So I would say for the United States, USMCA is delivering. I know we are going to spend some time today talking about areas of improvement, so I will not monopolize my time with that right now, but rather hand it over to my colleagues to talk about why USMCA has been good for them.
Great. Thank you, Nasim. Matt, would you like to jump in next on this kind of big picture about the performance and how you see it?
Sure, and thanks for having me. And for the auto sector, we believe that the USMCA has been extremely successful. President Trump and his trade team negotiated a better agreement, and one that's benefited the United States in lots of ways. And for the auto sector, at least, USMCA is not just a traditional trade agreement where you're capturing the advantages of comparative advantage and that sort of thing. It really is an agreement that welds together a manufacturing platform that keeps us competitive globally. And of course, as everybody I think knows, perhaps the most significant change in the USMCA was the automotive rule of origin. Well, really, they took a rule of origin that, like all rule of origins, was designed to ensure you didn't have a free rider problem, and really turned it into an economic development tool. And it's a tool that worked. Since USMCA went into effect, there's been over $230 billion of investment by automobile manufacturers. 75% of that was in the United States. For our member companies, Ford, General Motors, and Stellantis, 85% of that was in the United States. And I think actually in 2025, all of our member companies' major investments were announced in the United States. So we would argue that it has done exactly what President Trump intended for it to do, which was spur tremendous investment, not just in North America, but specifically in the United States. And one, I think, other metric you can look at is if you look at the percentage of automobile production in North America that occurred in the United States, under NAFTA, that generally declined year after year. Under USMCA, it leveled out and actually has started to increase. So that today, the United States produces 68% of the vehicles produced in North America, and that's up from 65% when USMCA went into effect. So for lots of reasons, we believe it's been a success. I'm sure lots of lessons that were learned from the transition from NAFTA to USMCA. Certainly one important lesson is the need for close collaboration with industry to ensure that any new requirements are indeed feasible. It turned out USMCA was feasible, but really just barely. It really did push the boundaries of what companies could do to adapt their supply chain. So close collaboration with industry is absolutely vital.
Great. Thank you, Matt. I'm sure we'll have some auto-specific questions coming up. There's a lot of unique features of the agreement for the auto sector. So thank you for sharing that perspective. Let's go to Jordan next for your perspective on the overall performance.
Yeah. So If you'll allow me, I just want to introduce Target to everyone. I know that everyone hopefully shops there all the time, enjoys all of our products, but honestly, I think Target, there's some things you might not know. So Target actually is an American-only company. We were founded in 1962 in Minneapolis, and we have almost 2,000 stores. We're very excited. Next month, we're opening our 2,000th store, 66 supply chain facilities in all 50 states, United States. But we don't have any stores outside the United States. So when we look at USMCA, keeping the agreement together is our number one priority. And so when we look at our portfolio of where we source from, so Target, we are not direct manufacturers of anything. We have to partner with our business partners to get the products to our store shelves. So when we look at our global footprint, actually in 2017, essentially we sell two broad buckets of items at our stores. We have our national brands, so think your Procter and Gamble's, your Kimberly Clark's, your L'Oreal, Unilever, a number of different partners that we have. Those are our national brands, but we also have what is known as our own brands or private label. That is where we have the most direct control over our supply chain. In 2017, the first year of the Trump administration, we were about 65% penetration in China for our own brands. By the end of last year, we're going to be under 25%, and that's something we're really proud of. The next question immediately we get is, so where is everything going? And I think for Target, we have been aggressively looking over that long time period of where we could do some diversity of our country of production. We have been involved in Canada and Mexico to make sure we deliver, especially what we call our frequency items. Those are items that you expect to be at the store all the time, whether it's your essentials and beauty, it's your toilet paper, it's your paper towel, it's your food. Those are items that you come, every single week to get. The having a consistent North American market is really important to that. So even that being said, the um, the con like having a continuous supply chain is really important. More than half of what we sell at Target is made in the United States, which is over $50 billion a year that we need to have in our stores made from the United States. So being able to have a flexible, continuous supply chain within USMCA is really important. Target, we're really excited to be a sponsor of WIDA's USMCA panel this year and really looking forward to seeing where things go from there.
Thank you for that, Jordan. Maria.
Hello, and thank you, WIDA and the panel. Looking forward to the discussion this afternoon. So from the agricultural perspective, I'd say that NAFTA and then subsequently USMCA has been a very good agreement for agricultural as a whole. And what we would like to see is the continuation of a USMCA that helps ensure the continuity that we have throughout our supply chains, in specifically to ag. For us, if you look at agricultural exports to both Canada and Mexico, we've seen our ag exports grow $20 billion, totaling since 2020. So over the last 5 years, we've seen a growth of $20 billion, and that's a total of $60 billion in 2024, and an additional $1.2 billion for seafood and agricultural products. If you look overall for agriculture and what percentage that means for growth, 47% growth rate is what we are seeing for agricultural goods into Canada and Mexico. And if you compare that to our global growth, that's a global growth of 18%. So for us in ag as a whole, I'd say that it is really important to have this agreement, to have the continuity of the agreement, and to continue to perhaps make changes, but in a very, very, very specific areas that need attention to detail, but not overall where we are looking at redoing the entire agreement. When it comes to pork, we are the fourth largest agricultural export to Canada and Mexico. Overall, for our producers and what we depend on is this trilateral union and unity that has been created under USMCA. And that's because we don't just work independently as a production unit. We depend on both Canada and Mexico and vice versa for our overall health of our animals, given the very, very long borders that we have with both Canada and Mexico. One of the areas of collaboration that we have been very proud of over the last decade has been, and especially now since USMCA, has been on animal health provisions and developing a continuity across the borders. So for us, when it comes to USMCA and our export market, Mexico in 2025, we exported close to $3 billion to Mexico, $761 million to Canada. But we're not just looking at exporting product, we're looking at importing, and we imported more pork products from Canada than we actually exported there. And to Mexico, we imported over $230 million from Mexico. So I'd say that overall, this agreement for agriculture has been very, very helpful in that product integration as we see throughout the supply chain. And not only for, as I mentioned, on the animal health side of things, but we've been able to reduce uncertainties at the border. We've been able to really put this region, the North American region, as a global food security space where the rest of the world can depend on US, Canada, and Mexico to export agricultural goods at a price that is very competitive, but also we strive on the food safety side of things as well. So overall, very positive. We're not looking to, we just want to have the market certainty and to have a review that is helpful, but also moves forward with the bulk of the agreement as is.
Thank you, Maria. And lastly, turn to Brad on this question of evaluating the overall performance and how you see it.
Thank you, Greta, and thank you, Wida. I want to really just build off of everything that the other panelists have said and bring it home. We started with BRT, a broad cross-sector trade, and we, the National Foreign Trade Council, NFTC, represent more than $6 trillion in global revenue, more than 6 million Americans, but also millions of more employees around the world and operations around the world. And those operations, first and foremost, run through Mexico and Canada. And so when you look at, what matters to American competitiveness, it is the fact that, Mexico and Canada are our number one export market. They're also the number one source of inputs for United States competitiveness. And so while we have global supply chains, ultimately we updated things like rules of origin, but it's important as we approach the review to have a level of stability as we enter into the agreement moving forward, which will help continued investments. And so as we look at, what's working and what's not, there are elements where we need the parties to live up to their obligations. We need Mexico to live up to financial services obligations for credit card processors. We need to ensure the intellectual property disciplines that were negotiated in USMCA are being enforced in Canada and in Mexico. But really what USMCA did was it extended duty-free trade across the bloc. And I think that is the most important element, that we continue to see that we can find a path forward back to seeing duty-free trade with Canada and Mexico, because ultimately that's what we need for the investment in the region. That's what we need for competitiveness. And just to build off of what Governor Blunt said around the automotive sector, we know that rules of origin are under focus in the review. And I think this is maybe where we're going to bridge into from the discussion from here. But the changes to rules of origin, Governor Blunt highlighted how complex those were, how there was significant engagement with industry, in particular for the automotive sector. And so as we look at the review, we need to ensure that that level of consultation continues, because the knock-on effects, the impact on tier 1, tier 2 suppliers that we've seen in the automotive sector, that we will see in other sectors if there's transformations, comes at a significant cost. It can be mitigated, but we really just need the USTR and the government to work alongside the industry to make sure that the review is not only extended, restores duty-free treatment, but also that we truly do upgrade the agreement. I'll pause there. Thanks, Retta.
Thank you. And thanks for all those comments. I think we heard a lot about how the agreement is working well, that it has increased investment in the auto sector and others in the United States, that exports have grown within the region, that we've become more integrated. And I think that that's uncontroversial, that those are all successes. The idea behind this review was that agreements get old also and may get stale, and that may happen quickly as technology moves and as trade flows shift, and as new issues come out. There's a critical minerals panel right before us, which is very relevant for the USMCA conversation. Also, maybe we didn't get everything we wanted in the first go round, or realize that the obligations we got were not the ones that we hoped that they would be, that we didn't get out of them the things that we were hoping to. So would be interested in hearing from each of you. You can either talk to your priorities, your company's priorities, or you could comment on what we're hearing from the administration about how it's thinking about its priorities. We've heard about rules of origin, for sure, the idea of this Fortress North America. Ambassador Greer highlighted a few issues in his report around labor enforcement, the deficit in goods, some harmful changes in Mexico's business climate. I think energy trade has always been a point of contention, even since the negotiation concluded. Digital practices in Canada. So I think if you could provide your perspective either on what you think the priorities should be, or your members, the companies think they should be, or how the administration is thinking about its priorities, and whether there's a tension, and sort of any comments you'd like to make on that. And we'll shake up the order a little bit just to make sure you're all paying attention. So maybe Maria, can we start with you?
Sure. Happy to chat about that. I think overall, for us in the pork sector, we are not looking for changes. NAFTA and then subsequently USMCA maintained zero tariff market access into both Canada and Mexico, and vice versa. Now, are there areas where we can enhance the agreement? I'd say that the one that comes to mind for us in our industry is probably Chapter 28, the Committee of Good Regulatory Practices. There's an opportunity there to streamline a bit of trade through collaborating more on foreign animal diseases and prevention of those foreign animal diseases and outbreaks. We're seeing a lot of that right now through the New World Screwworm and the issues that has caused at the borders mainly for beef and cattle in the ag sectors. But obviously, this is something that would affect U.S. pork, and it is the screwworm does not just inflict or cause issues on cattle. So I think that when it comes to issues like that, there's certainly more room for enhancement. But there's also a few, if I can digress perhaps a little bit, in agriculture as a whole, I know that there's other commodities that perhaps are not as do not see the agreement as having lived up to all of the areas that they would like to have in the past. And I think that's part of what we are dealing with when it comes on the pork side to the anti-dumping and countervailing duty cases that were just filed on U.S. pork at the end of December. The president herself, Scheinbaum, has said that the reason behind those is because of the termination of the tomato suspension agreement on the U.S. side. And what we've now encountered is a bit of a tit for tat, where you have certain constituents that are very open to having some changes within USMCA to address those longstanding concerns. And unfortunately for us on the pork side, we're getting stuck in the middle. And I think one thing that I caution and I'm more concerned about is perhaps that we go down this mechanism of tomato suspension agreement, then we get countervailing duties, AD/CVD on pork. Now we've got an AD case on strawberries. Now they've retaliated on U.S. apples. And ultimately, what does that mean for the agreement as a whole and our ability to be competitive? And what does that mean when it comes to the broader agricultural agreement and some of the issues that that certain sectors may want to get addressed? So there's a little bit more question mark on those seasonality issues, I'd say. But certainly we don't like to get sideswiped by issues like that. But overall, I'd say agriculture as a whole is very happy with the agreement. We've seen huge growth in our markets. And it's not just, like I've rattled off, it's not just the export side of things. We import quite a bit of products from Canada and Mexico, and that's what makes the North American region so competitive internationally.
Great. Thanks for flagging those issues. Jordan, let's go next to you.
Yeah, great. So Target, I'd say our main focus is the consumer and only the American consumer, because every person that buys our products are in the United States. So when I look at USMCA, I see two issues going on. Let's just talk about number one, resiliency. And I talked about these frequency items. So these goods that people purchase all the time. A lot of these frequency items are both made for the consumers in both Canada and Mexico and the United States, a lot of similar things. And so having stable, sustainable production of those products, whether it's from our national brands or from our private label brands, is really essential in order to make sure that we have reliable products. So the resiliency piece within USMCA and the continuity between the three is really important. Now, let's talk about the other part, which is nearshoring, onshoring, or growing in this hemisphere. I think that's a strong, obviously, focus of this administration. Target does depend on a significant amount of our sourcing from Asia. And as we look to grow the Western Hemisphere in the next few years, there's going to be a number of things that we depend on that the administration could be helpful on. I think there is an acknowledgement from the administration that they don't want or need everything to be made in the United States. Particularly, I look at textiles. If you look at the carve-outs for CAFTA qualifying textiles in even the most recent 122 tariffs, or the carve-outs for textiles in the recent Bangladesh trade agreement or others, I think there's an acknowledgement from the administration that let's just take textiles, for example, not all of it needs to be made in the United States. But just because there is a tariff differential between Mexico and even Central America compared to Southeast Asia doesn't automatically mean a company and a brand will move their production over immediately. Number one, we have standards of vendor engagement. That means a number of things, but first off, we need to make sure that there's the availability of inputs for our products. The factory is able and the vendor is able to produce it at the quality and scale that we need. There might be a vendor available, but we serve over 100 million customers every single year. We need to be able to service all 2,000 of our stores so people that come into our stores are able to access those products. And also, the way we do business is somewhat new for some people. For us, responsible sourcing is key to how we drive our business. So when we talk about labor conditions, when we talk about environmental conditions, some vendors that we work with have just never had to meet our standards, while many of the vendors and factories that we've worked with in Asia have been doing that for a number of years. So I say all that, while Target is not an exporter, we are dependent on Mexico and Canada within the USMCA agreement and the resiliency. Really, our focus, as far as working with the U.S. government on our offensive negotiating strategy, is on the labor attaches and support for freedom of association within our factories in Mexico, in Canada, and also making sure that that these factories are able to meet our labor standards in order to be able to be our vendors. So we have talked a lot about that internally. We've talked about it with our groups, but I think like that's an interesting area where if the administration, which I think they're serious about nearshoring our products, it's not simply just about tariffs. It's about how brands do business. And for us, our brand, we really care about how business is done, not just the cost of the product. And so that's an area where when we look at onshoring, we are putting in a significant amount of work to work with our vendors, work with them to meet our standards, to be able to become world-class manufacturers that can support our customers at the values that they expect and at the price.
Thanks for that, Jordan. It's a great point about sort of the standard-based trade, and the USMCA obviously made a lot of strides in that area, but could potentially do more in cooperation with companies. Brad, maybe I'll go to you next. It'd be great if you could speak to whatever you were going to speak to, but also to digital trade to the extent you weren't already going to cover that, because that has been, particularly with Canada, a continued source of irritation between the parties. One that, I think in the USMCA negotiation, of course, a lot of progress was made, but not with some of the particular measures that Canada was looking to adopt. So if you could speak to that, as well as other priorities that you'd like to talk about.
Thanks, Greta. I appreciate it. Ultimately, we want to see the USMCA renewed, but we also care deeply about how we get there. And so when you look at the process moving forward, we have NFTC represents every sector of the economy. We have members across each of those channels that have a number of different priorities. Nassim actually highlighted some of them at the outset, and we've heard some of them highlighted from some of the other panelists here today. But when it comes to an element like digital, when you look at Chapter 19, when you look at the digital provisions, a lot of the reason that USMCA was touted as the gold standard agreement is because the digital rules were modernized after 25 years. When you look at the rules today, a lot of them continue to be fit for purpose. You look at what's happened since USMCA came into force, and everybody will look at artificial intelligence. But when you look at the digital rules, you have cross-border data flows, you have protections for data localization, you have protections for source code and algorithmic integrity. And so these are the key elements that ultimately, when we look at something like AI, are going to be critically important. And so perhaps as we look at this review, there's an opportunity for an AI side agreement or something that points back to some of these elements and opportunities to strengthen some of those provisions. But when you look at ultimately the disciplines, I think the core tenets are there and are strong, and we don't necessarily need to open this. And I think that can be replicated across a number of the different chapters. Now, to irritants, however, when you look at Canada's Online Streaming Act, when you look at online news, there are a number of digital barriers. We have ultimately been able to resolve the digital services tax with Canada, but we need to continue to push on some of those issues. And some of those are being brought up in the bilateral channels. And I think that's correct. Like, those are bilateral issues that can continue to be worked on. But ultimately, this needs to remain a trilateral agreement and a trilateral framework. So however we get through addressing some of these issues to the outcome, what's core is that we have an upgraded USMCA. And I think the final thing I will maybe add in here is, some of the metric around USMCA and around all of the trade issues is the deficit and the fact that we are importing far more than we are exporting from Canada and Mexico. as Jordan highlighted, we need to understand who our friends are, who are going to nearshore to. And I would contest that, Canada and Mexico are the trusted and most logical allies, and therefore restoring that duty-free trade is really critical here, not only for USMCA conforming goods. And so ultimately, I think that's our priority in the review, is to get back to the competitiveness, back to the stability, and restore some predictability so that our businesses can invest across North America and just strengthen those manufacturing footprints that are a priority to the administration.
Great. Thank you, Brad. And Matt, going to you, I hope that you will talk some about rules of origin and in the autos sector and thinking about how the administration is looking at this. And also think about, I think one interesting thing about where we are now with, we obviously have duties in place, including auto specific. I think that one dynamic that goes along with rules of origin is sort of what is the X agreement tariff that you're going to pay, and here it's much higher, potentially, right? If we're kind of living under the current regime for a while. And so, so also thinking about that, how do you think about the administration's priorities, but also your members' priorities?
Well, sure. And, I think in terms of, our ultimate goal for the USMCA review is that we would get back to duty-free trade for qualifying goods. And I'm sure most of your listeners know this, but the NAFTA rule of origin was by far the most stringent rule of origin of any automotive agreement in the world. And if it was still in place today, it'd be the second most stringent, only to the USMCA, which took the NAFTA rule of origin and created lots of new requirements that are unique to USMCA. As I said earlier, requirements that you have to say worked, that did spur a tremendous amount of investment. And, we would argue that you don't need major changes in the rule of origin. The first Trump administration was really pretty forward thinking as they thought through the automotive industry and what the needs of the future could be. We've made some recommendations around some of the labor value content requirements, but they're really on the margins. We think that the rule of origin has been a success, and as I said, by far the most stringent in the world. As we think through some of the administration's priorities, things they're talking to us about, we certainly understand their concerns with non-market economy content and their desire to ensure that that's not circumventing any sort of trade agreement coming in at a much lower rate than it should be tariffed at. If you're going to address it, we think you can address it in a way that creates a more robust North American automotive supply chain, which is our shared goal. But if you address non-market economy content only in USMCA and don't address it in the other agreements on reciprocal trade, particularly when you're talking about automotive trading partners like Japan, you've really created a pathway for Chinese or other non-market economy content to come in the United States in a much lower tariff rate and with an advantage over products built here in North America.
That's a great point. I think all of this has to be taken into context with all the other moving parts of agreements and tariffs and what kind of incentives you're creating. I think that's an excellent point. Nasim, I'd like to go to you, and maybe along with your comments on the priorities, if you could say any words about the indications from the administration that there may be a two-track agreement and whether that serves or does not serve the priorities for negotiation as you see them.
Thanks, Greta. Absolutely. Before I dive into that, I just want to piggyback on one thing that Matt said, which I think is really important more broadly about, where we might go next on potential rules changes in the review. The important thing about the auto rules of origin is that they were staged in, right? So there was a period of staging, which I think is a really important thing that we stay focused on. I think that was critical and necessary for the companies because changes of this magnitude can't be made like the flip of a light switch. So I think that was an important feature of those new rules. But as the administration is thinking about these potential changes of equal, if not greater magnitude, when multiplied across numerous sectors. These staging periods are important, but I think it's also important to keep in mind that there was a staging period when you're trying to assess how quickly impact was felt and what those numbers of investment look like in the United States, and not lose sight of that if it's not the number you were expecting within 6 years, it doesn't automatically equal that they didn't work, that they weren't doing their job, right? So I think there's like what we all see on the headline, and then what's really happening under the hood. And I think that's just an important factor to keep in mind, particularly if and as we think about new changes. So on priorities for Business Roundtable, I should have said at the beginning, by the way, Brad reminded me, I'm here with good friends who know who I represent, but for the audience, Business Roundtable represents over 200 CEOs of leading American companies, so US-based companies, and across every sector. And this agreement, as I mentioned at the beginning, is very important. Among our priorities are to keep USMCA trilateral. I will also mention one more, which one of my colleagues mentioned, but I'll come back to your trilateral and importance of integration question, Greta. So another really important priority for our membership is maintaining and fully restoring the duty-free structure of USMCA. Of course, this means for USMCA compliant trade. And, you know, as we've all discussed here, there are really high standard, robust rules here. And if you're adhering to them to maintain the integrity of this agreement, and I think the economic competitiveness of the North American market, we want to ensure that we're talking about fully duty-free trade for USMCA compliant goods. And that includes goods subject to Section 232 tariffs currently. So on the importance of trilateral, this is critical. You know, there's unfortunately very little data, just to put this out there, about what happens if you break this agreement into two separate pacts or one pact. Why is that? You'd have to make a lot of assumptions about what those new agreements look like in order to really be able to model this. But what I can tell you anecdotally, based on talking to our companies, is that they have built supply chains around the integrated nature of USMCA and NAFTA before that. So we're talking about over 30 years of integration of supply chains being built within North America, and depending the economies depending on one another within the pact in order to produce in the region and serve customers within the region. If I can just point out a few stats. So every dollar of manufacturing imports from North America, it supports more domestic activity and US jobs than trade with more distant partners. And OECD data show that about 15% of the value of US manufacturing inputs from Canada and Mexico reflects US work coming back home. And let's compare that by contrast to imports from China, which contain less than 2% in US value. So this is just one example of how we can talk about the importance of this market. And if I can just use this to also just pivot into another point that's important for BRT, which also relates to my point on duty-free trade, which is something that the administration is thinking about. And we've seen in a few of the reciprocal trade agreements as well already, which is this concept of an economic security pact with our trading partners. We do see in USMCA a great deal of opportunity through the review to align and cooperate more with Canada and Mexico on issues such as investment screening, you know, looking together and in alignment at sensitive investments from China, for example, and other non-market economies, given that there are more broad concerns about excess capacity, and how we can work together with Canada and Mexico to address that, to maintain that fortress you referred to, Greta. We can also work together on export controls. The panel before us talked about how we can work together, whether it's through coordinated pricing and other mechanisms on critical minerals, and so on and so forth. We feel strongly that the agreement has the infrastructure to do that without, you know, blowing everything up. There's a competitiveness committee and many other components within USMCA already that we can utilize to address these issues together.
Thank you, Nasim, and thank you to all the panelists for providing perspectives. I think I certainly learned a lot about the operation performance of the agreement from the business community perspective, and really appreciate your sharing your thoughts and views. And with that, I will pass it back to Ken.
Thanks so much. Guys, we should have given you an hour, 2 hours. I don't know how long. We could have gone on and on about this. Good news, WIDA's USMCA review series will let us go on and on about this. So more to come. Thank you, Matt Blunt, Jordan Dickinson, Nasim Fussell, Brad Wood, Maria Ziba, and Greta Peisch. Thank you so much for joining us. Really, really appreciate it. Our next topic is one that we've been talking a lot about at WIDA in recent months and will continue to be a strong focus for us in the year to come, including at our second Trade and Technology Summit, which will be coming in December. As I ask our next panel to please turn on their screens, I want to call out some of those who are with us at the conference from our global audience. James Greathouse with the Embassy of Canada, Caitlin Hornby with the Embassy of Australia, Ruth Schnipper with the Embassy of the Netherlands, and Masanori Takano at the Embassy of Japan. Welcome, James, Caitlin, Ruth, and Masanori. And again, glad to have all of you with us. Digital trade, e-commerce, AI, and trade have never been more important to the global economy than they are today. And I think it's safe to say we'll be saying that, as I mentioned, at WIDA for a long time. And we have a great group of speakers to help us understand the importance of this to U.S. leadership and the opportunities and obstacles facing us in digital trade. Ari Giovenco is head of U.S. trade policy at Amazon and one of our conference benefactors. Thank you, Ari, and thank you, Amazon. Khalil Gabray is a senior director of trade policy at Microsoft. Kate Kalukowicz is a senior managing director at McLarty Associates. Jonathan McHale is vice president digital trade at the Computer and Communications Industry Association, CCIA. And our moderator, Ed Britswa, Vice President International Trade at the Consumer Technology Association, CTA. Thank you all for joining us today.
Well, thank you, Ken, for inviting us to speak with the WIDA audience. It's really a pleasure to be with my friends here. I was listening to the introductions, and what I wanted to say, like at the time when Ken was introducing Jonathan, is that he should also be the godfather of digital trade. I think that's an appropriate moniker for Jonathan, given his many years of service to digital trade and to the trade policy community. So, but I've got some goals. We should all have goals in life, right? Goals for this particular panel. And what I want us to do today is 4 things. 1, outline for our audience the importance of U.S. technology leadership and how digital trade relates to that. And then explore the private sector view of U.S. policy on digital trade. We all used to serve in government, but now we've got private sector hats, so I think we can explore the private sector side. Describe the intersection of AI and digital trade, and also maybe touch on tariffs, which not a day goes by these days that I think about tariffs. And then finally, define the priority barriers to digital trade that the United States must address to strengthen its trade and technology leadership. I think we can do all those things, right, guys? Good. Okay, so I have some opening questions, and I'm going to start with you, Kate. Look, you served in Trump 1.0. You've been in Brussels for USTR. You've been in, Amazon. How would you characterize the current administration's digital trade strategy and the continuity with prior approaches? Has there been any shift in philosophy at all?
Well, it's hard to ignore that in the second iteration of the Trump presidency, a focus on manufacturing. Obviously, the president has spent a lot of time in the past year doubling down on his interest to reshore what he considers to be critical sectors. And in some cases, it seems like we're trying to reinvent the 1950s America. And the question is, where is digital in all of that? despite some early signals, actually. We had an EO on digital trade. We had, comments around the DSTs. But the actions really, I think, have underscored more of an interest in some of this targeted manufacturing. I think we've seen some signals that could change. And I think actually, we're not here to talk about tariffs, but the SCOTUS decision actually could open the door for some meaningful 301 investigations into things like digital, which I'd really like to see. That would be a continuation of the first Trump administration, which we saw launch and conclude 301 investigations into digital services taxes. We've seen USTR Greer talk not only recently, but in his confirmation hearings about wanting to target discriminatory digital trade policies in places like Europe, where I served, but also in Asia, where we see some copycat measures emerging in places like Korea. We've seen language in the Brazil 301. So I think we may well be at the precipice of a return to some of the policies we saw in the first Trump administration around confronting these digital trade policies. That would be a welcome development, in my opinion, and also, frankly, I think align with the president's talking points on wanting to support U.S. AI and tech leadership. We haven't seen that in his tariff policy, but we could see it very much in some sectoral 301 investigations.
Yeah, thank you for that, Kate. I mean, we heard at CES, our trade show in Las Vegas in January, loud and clear from the administration that they absolutely want to address these barriers to trade to advance U.S. technology leadership. I think I see a lot of strength so far. But Ari, you work for Amazon. Amazon is everywhere, it seems. It's in my street every day. What should the priorities of the United States be in shaping global digital trade rules to ensure that we can continue to lead on AI and other emerging tech? And just define the stakes for us at this moment.
First, Ed, thanks for being a customer, and thanks to WIDA for putting this together today and inviting us. Yeah, just quick to help contextualize the conversation a little bit from the Amazon perspective of kind of why driving a tech-centric trade agenda really makes a lot of sense. We're using AI to improve our customers' lives. Think our AI innovations around Rufus, powering conversational Alexa, customer reviews. We're also using AI to help with our operations network as well. So we've deployed 750,000 mobile robots in our operations network to not only help add hundreds of thousands of jobs worldwide, but also to help improve worker safety and ensure we're planning, forecasting, delivering faster, better. We're working through inventory management at our fulfillment centers. And we're also working with a lot of other companies as well, with our customs chips for compute, with our large language model services, with our application layers. We're investing in AI, and we're making really big bets. So practically, what this means for not only us, but for companies, and especially small companies. I think that this will be part of a future conversation today, but small manufacturers are going to be able to use AI tools for quality control. The small retailers are going to be able to use this for inventory management. And we're going to see a lot of, medium-sized services firms helping accelerate a lot of the different customer services they're providing. So, bottom line, we really see if we want to be a leader on AI, we're going to really need AI the American way. We're going to need the U.S. really leading. And, for us, this has driven just huge investments. In 2025, we invested $340 billion into the United States. And these are huge bets. These are huge bets. And it's going to be important that the U.S. government continues to really work towards that innovation-minded trade policy. That's going to basically, look at cooperation with our trading partners. It's going to look at how we can most effectively, ensure that there's not a patchwork of conflicting regulations around the world that are going to impact how we're able to deploy and develop these services. So, this we'll dive a little bit deeper later in the discussion, but we're grateful to see that these issues have been a priority of this administration. We're We're hoping they continue their work to level the playing field, secure commitments from countries to prevent policies that are going to, at the end of the day, disadvantage U.S. Technology providers. So, Ed, thanks for kicking things off, and yeah, looking forward to the rest of the conversation.
No, thank you, Ari. Khalil, I want to shift to you. Microsoft has been a leader on technology for as long as I can remember. I mean, people think about digital issues and they think about Microsoft, but you've got presence in many different markets around the world. What should the U.S. strategy be when it comes to working with allies at this moment? And I know we have some differences of views with our allies and other trading partners, but how do we do that in a way that prevents a fragmentation of the global digital economy?
Oh, thanks, Ed, and thanks to Wida for having me. Appreciate the setup there, noting Microsoft's wisdom as an older technology company. Much like our friends at Amazon, we're a company that's focused on AI adoption and diffusion, both in the U.S. and to our customers globally. And so we're very focused on digital trade rules and their ability to support U.S. tech leadership and to help align allies around trusted digital infrastructure, and to prevent market access barriers that directly harm U.S. digital exports. On your question about strategy, I think there are things that administration's already doing and should be called out, and some things that we could add. Really positive that the administration is focused on making the e-commerce duty moratorium permanent. That's one area where we could see a lot of fragmentation really quickly if they don't prevail. I think expanding the reciprocal trade agreements that have had a major focus on digital, and then working towards a new or updated gold standard agreement that could include issues around interoperable AI, cyber cooperation, and combating technical barriers to trade and digital services. And the bottom line really is that we should just expand the set of issues where we're working with a broad set of partners on shared interests. And so we're seeing seeds of that with Pax Silica, looking at the AI supply chain, looking at critical minerals, cooperation with partners. But I think there's a lot more that can be done there. And ultimately, those type of efforts and work with partners on alignment of standards, good regulatory practices, those are all things that continue to have a lot of commercial relevance.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned alignment, because alignment does involve addressing some barriers to trade. And Jonathan, you have been addressing barriers to trade ever since I've known you at USTR. Tell us about how breaking down barriers to digital trade, such as data localization requirements, discriminatory regulations on tech, software source code, mandates, how does this advance U.S. technology leadership and align with our broader goals like national security or competitiveness?
Thanks, Ed, and thanks, Guido, for this great opportunity. Great group you have here. I think the key point that I focus on is it's sort of like what we're at a stage not too different than when we started looking at the internet generally, and the ability of companies to scale and reach global markets and global consumers really quickly is remarkable. I think at that same time, as in back then, trade partners are also pretty excited about the possibilities this technology offers. And so we do have a willing partner on the other side to try and encourage the investment and encourage the deployment of new services. The barriers are longstanding, though, and whether it's data localization, whether it's inability to move data back and forth between jurisdictions. Khalil mentioned standards, which I think is critical in this area. You're not going to be able to scale. You're not going to be able to have your services be able to address the global market in an efficient manner. I think for CCIA members, and probably true for all of the companies here, more or about half of the consumers are outside the US. So you cannot live without accessing that market. And the fact that we are in a stage where there's this extraordinary investment in this field. One estimate I saw from a Wall Street Journal article last week was it's the equivalent of the U.S. investment in the railroad industry right now. You're not going to be able to get a return to that unless you can reach these global markets, and unless these barriers are addressed, then the U.S. Ability to offer the services in a coherent manner is threatened, and then U.S. economic leadership is threatened. The big comparator is, of course, China. China is also very good at these very same technologies. Well, the difference is they have their own massive domestic market. We don't. We've got a very big market, very wealthy market, but we also are much more dependent on our ability to reach other markets than I think China is.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned China. I want to talk about U.S. technology leadership, but we did get one question in the chat already, actually in the questions and answers, that I thought was quite interesting. And Kate, I want to turn to you for this. I mean, it seems this administration is really prioritizing manufacturing and industrial policy, and some of those measures it's undertaking might be considered protectionist. But if they want to address barriers to digital trade and advance our trade policy leadership abroad on digital issues, how do they balance that with the industrial policy side of the equation?
Look, that's a really fair question. It's a tough one to answer because, of course, the Trump administration has prioritized measures that are trying to influence companies to move back to the United States. So I think it's a very fair point. I'd say on digital policy, digital trade writ large, I think the administration has really focused on our barriers that are intended to specifically discriminate and target American companies for the pure benefit of creating opportunities for national champions. And I would say these are two very different types of policies. We've seen foreign companies do very well in the United States because of these Trump administration policies as well, frankly. Anything that the Trump administration has spoken about, for example, with respect to offset mechanisms for new investments, for our chip subsidies, for things that have incentivized companies to invest in manufacture in the United States, have been open to foreign companies as well. We are not charging foreign companies to invest in our infrastructure. We are not doing things like fair share proposals or digital services taxes, which really predominantly target American companies. So I think it's fair to ask the question, but I would argue in reality, it's not really a fair comparison.
What point well taken. I think the conversation we should have is about what the offensive agenda looks like. I mean, we've been on defense for quite a while over the last year, but now I think the administration is transitioning into this offensive agenda through its trade agreement negotiations. And Kate or Jonathan, what does that offensive agenda really look like? And what, especially after Friday?
Well, I'll offer just very quickly, and then I'm very interested in what Jonathan has to say. The offensive agenda to me, and particularly if we're talking about this question of working with allies, is we look at the past. We look at even frankly during the first Trump administration when there was a heavy focus on infrastructure, on technical infrastructure in the Huawei situation. And I think we really want to avoid repeating that. And I think this is a moment when we should be working together to be choosing an AI stack, to be choosing digital tools and assets, which are high standard, which don't have concerns around some of the things that the Chinese are putting out into the marketplace. And I think it's in both of our interests, all of our interests, frankly, from the shared alliance perspective.
Sure, I can just add. I mean, I think the focus on export of the AI stack sort of almost encapsulates, could arguably encapsulate almost everything digital, both from devices to software to chips, data centers, etc. The question of an offensive agenda in terms of a trade negotiation is something that still needs to be worked out. I mean, to date, we've put tariffs out there and then said, if you want to buy these down, you have to do certain things. That may no longer be as easy to do as it has been in the past. What we've had from other trade partners has been them making commitments, us saying in reaction we will lower the tariff. So it hasn't been a real negotiation in the traditional sense. It would be nice to move back to a much more back and forth with trade partners where we make commitments, they make commitments, and you can have sort of more stability in the relationship. But in terms of the themes I think are pretty well laid out there. We have in many of these reciprocal trade agreements some of the essences of what we want from foreign partners in the digital space. We've got agreement not to put data localization in place, agreement not to require companies to have to share revenue for the news entities in country, for example, the ability to move data, focus on standardization that's helpful to U.S. companies. So I think some of the core elements are there. It's just what's the format and how is it moving forward that we can do it in a more deliberative fashion.
Well, Jonathan, you mentioned the AI export promotion program, and I think this is a really interesting example. Khalil, many U.S. companies have been focused on how to participate in this program. They've offered comments, CTA, we offered comments to the Department of Commerce. What is that program going to look like, and how inclusive is that stack going to be, or can our allies even participate in it?
I've heard the State Department address that question recently, and I think they are looking at ways that partners will be able to participate in the stack. And the program writ large. It is something that they're still defining. We saw that request for comments that you alluded to. Microsoft also filed some comments. So we know that Commerce, State, and others are still working on what the different deliverables will be. In our comments, we emphasized the ability to address blockers to really get at some core trade policy issues, because those arise mainly for us in the procurement space, and that's an area where you could see, in the context of advocacy, both addressing the blocker or getting regulatory reform at large, as well as getting a lighthouse win or two, and just showing the value of U.S. technology to that partner. I also think it's an area that the administration is realizing that they need a broader sales pitch. And you saw some of that with Michael Kratsios at the India AI Summit, starting to delve into some of the sovereignty issues.
Well, in order to make sure that this program is successful to export the AI tech stack from the United States, we need to have non-discrimination against, ensure that's a principle. I mean, I know this is tough to say at the moment, but non-discrimination is like a core principle for us to advance our exports. So Ari, I'm going to go back to you. AI is ubiquitous. Your company is investing heavily in it, just like Microsoft is. Like every company seems to be investing in AI. So make this linkage for us to this program and your goals on AI and non-discrimination in particular.
Yeah, thanks, Ed. And, I think just to kind of working backwards for a second here, kind of the experience that we've had around the world related to regulation. And, a lot of it, in our view, has been targeted, has been discriminatory. We're talking digital markets regulations, taxes, fines, network fees, various different levels of AI legislation, digital sovereignty, procurement restrictions, streaming regulations, and then kind of a more recent development are new investigations under the Digital Markets Act in the EU related to cloud and AI. So expanding what that may look like, and all of these have a pretty similar thread that really look at policy making through the lens of let's try to kind of draw the circle around a small group of U.S. companies. And so, just quick to what we've been seeing in some of the markets, and in particular in Europe, this has meant that we're hearing from small businesses that are saying 40 to 45% of their tech budget goes to compliance costs. these are going to be adoption barriers to AI, and 31% of small and medium-sized enterprises are reporting those costs as major obstacles to essentially deploying what could make their businesses more competitive at the end of the day. So we're also seeing the launch or the delay or the inability to launch new services in certain markets. And so, this is going to impact how AI services are able to reach customers, are going to impact how we're able to continue investing in those jobs and other parts of the infrastructure needed to build out AI here in the U.S. So, again, as others have said already, we're pleased some of the Latin America deals, the Asian deals do look at a number of these different issues and do work to get at that non-discrimination piece that you already mentioned, Ed. So, we're hopeful. There's a lot of these commitments that are still a bit up in the air. We're really focused on ensuring that these commitments turn into real tangible outcomes in the coming year. We're seeing regulations and taxes already in force. Obviously, we want to stop new policies that are coming and address those in the right way. But we also do have to deal with a number of policies that are already on the books. And as Khalil also mentioned, we're very, very much supportive of kind of seeing what some of these different programs look like at the Department of Commerce, at state. Watched very closely some of the announcements and ways that these issues are being talked about at the AI Impact Summit last week. And I think that this is all part of the same equation that's going to help figure out how we can deploy AI in much bigger and better ways, and really ensuring that it stays U.S. centric.
Thank you, Ari. I think there's this really interesting relationship between the AI export program and what USTR is doing on addressing barriers to trade. And I know this is going to cause a little bit of pain for some of you who worked on this, but the NT, the National Trade Estimate Report, in the past, it was just this big repository of barriers to trade. We're never sure what the government did with it. I wrote parts of it in my past life in the government. But now it seems like, Kate, that this government is using the NTE to actually hold its trading partners to account, and like the issues that come up in that are being addressed in some ways. Is that fair?
I think it's fair. I think we should give credit where it's due. It does seem like USTR and this administration are going after some of these barriers that, as you point out, companies have been complaining about for years and years and years, and we've all written about them. I mean, that would be a really great development, in my opinion. The Brazil, I started my career at USTR working on Brazil. So to see that 301 come from years of an NTE, I think, which demonstrated serious concerns about, Brazilian policies that were impacting U.S. companies. We'll see what comes from that 301. I think probably for all of us that worked on that document, it was exhilarating to see the president hold it up on Liberation Day. We haven't seen a lot of follow-up from that yet. Maybe this new phase of trade policy following SCOTUS will lead the way for more action on the NTE. I can tell you, we certainly advise all clients to participate in that process, as they should in every Federal Register process. There is a way to get concerns on the board, and at some point, USTR hopefully will address some of those with trading partners.
I think you make a really great point here that the tools now, especially after Friday, now they might change to a certain extent. There might be a stronger use of Section 301, for example, to investigate these measures that have been identified in the NTE. I mean, Khalil or Jonathan, I'd love to have your thoughts about this.
Sure. Definitely. We've heard that there are 301s that are sitting ready to go. That don't have any particular knowledge of the truth of that, but that's certainly the rumor. And I think that this does reflect the fact that there are barriers that are out there that have not been acted on, and the USTR wants to have a program for being able to move forward in this area. So whether it's DSTs, whether it's news bargaining codes, whether it's some of these video restrictions in Canada and in Australia that are inconsistent with an FTA, they're a mechanism for addressing them in a deliberative manner would be helpful from our perspective. So again, this is enforcement. It's not about tariffs for revenue purposes. The goal is not the tariffs per se. The goal is obviously to solve the problems, but it's a tried and tried and tested method for engaging with foreign governments in ways that can help make for a more open market in the foreign side.
Well, we know that the administration is also prioritizing the WTO e-commerce moratorium. And we've seen this in ART after ART, where there's a commitment to support making the moratorium permanent at the WTO. But Khalil, this moratorium, that technically moratorium on customs duties and electronic transmissions, it's been around since 1998, I believe. It's under a lot of pressure at the WTO. A lot of governments don't want to continue it. So if it did lapse, I'm not saying it will, but if it did lapse, what's the impact on AI-enabled services and digitally delivered products that are core to U.S. economic competitiveness at this point?
Yeah, it's definitely under a lot of pressure. It survived some prior near-death situations, but with the commitment from Indonesia and some ongoing discussions with India, hopefully we're on our way. I mean, the risks are really go to the foundation of the digital economy, and so AI services are all built on that, and our existing tariff systems don't map to digital services. It's just going to invite a lot of fragmentation and arbitrary application of customs rules and potentially tariffs if we lose the moratorium, and that's going to mean higher costs. It's going to mean potentially slower AI diffusion, and the way that typically works is that those that are that are less connected today are left further behind. So ending the moratorium is just going to undermine predictability, and it's also a very inefficient way to generate revenue.
Hey, Jonathan or Kate, Ari, do you want to dive into moratorium?
Just to say that having been there and discussed this with the various members of the WTO, Indonesia was sort of the poster child for moving forward and the most resistant to changes because they've already created a tariff line for digitally delivered products. So the fact that Indonesia is now not only dropping that but agreeing to propose this to support a permanent moratorium is I find remarkable. India, we'll see. South Africa, we'll see. But the fact that Indonesia is out of that game is, I think, really important. I also think, just as an aside, it was in a way a distraction for the WTO. It was a very convenient hostage that members could take to try and get leverage for other issues, but it was not healthy for the WTO to be grappling with this every year. One country, Indonesia, started going down the path, but most countries completely understood that it was a bad idea. And so just getting it off the table, I think, is really going to be very helpful in many, many ways to help move forward.
I think it's very notable that you've got the bilateral commitments, and the administration has this bilateral approach, but it is going to have they'll be paying a dividend at the multilateral level at some point, maybe even in Cameroon next month, where the ministerial conference is supposed to happen. But this is not the only international engagement that the administration will have this year. WTO just being one example. There's other examples like China and APEC or the G20. I mean, Kate, how's the administration going to handle these multilateral negotiations if it's got this bilateral only preference? Is it going to be ready to go in the multilateral level?
Well, it's a good question and probably not a straightforward answer. I mean, I think this administration will do what suits them best in the moment. I think mostly that's going to be a bilateral context. And whether we use bilateral contexts to secure things in a multilateral space, I think the preference will continue to be to do these one-off agreements. Now, that's not always true. Sometimes the groupings help. We've seen some forward momentum in the G7. I think the G7 probably is the institution, the grouping that makes the most sense for this administration's objectives. I'm not convinced that G20 or APEC are really going to be opportunities, more so than just convening opportunities to hold bilateral meetings. But again, I don't think there is a hard and fast rule. This administration, this team will take whatever opportunity they have. But they do recognize, I think, that a one-on-one with the United States is going to be more in the interest of the United States of America than big formats where other countries can align against our objectives.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting to see how this all unfolds, particularly in a year of U.S.-China détente with 4 presidential meetings. But that could be a topic for a future WIDA conversation. I want to go back to the T word, tariffs, because I don't think we can escape it. If we're going to have a major AI build out in the United States, that requires a lot of investments and also requires the purchasing of inputs for the build out itself. And Jonathan, that involves infrastructure costs as well. So if AI deployment depends on the servers that companies purchase, the semiconductors, the networking equipment, the cooling systems, energy infrastructure, how do the administration's tariffs, under whatever authority, Section 122 now, potentially 301, how does that increase costs for the build out and slow the pace of the infrastructure over time?
Sure. So, in theory, a lot of this equipment could be built in the U.S. and manufactured here, and the goal of the administration could be achieved by helping to reshore stuff. In many cases, that's not the case, though. You think in the semiconductor space, some of the photolithography equipment, we don't make it. Chinese and the Dutch do. Same in many areas where you've got very specialized companies in countries that are not in the U.S. and they're not able to immediately transfer production over to the U.S. The bottom line is that if you put tariffs on those types of products that we absolutely need, you are going to raise the cost. You're going to reduce the U.S. competitiveness in this space. I think the good news is, at least in part of this area, many of these products still do come in duty free. So semiconductors still come in duty free. Servers assembled in Mexico, for the most part, I think generally benefit from duty free treatment. The U.S. industry has been moving its supply chains away from China and towards more trusted allies, and some of those are the ones that are benefiting from the lower tariffs. So I think to some extent the threat has been mitigated, but it is a looming problem going forward if there's ongoing unpredictability and you've got massive investments that you need to fund and build out on. And so it's certainly worth keeping an eye on it to make sure that our long-term competitiveness is not materially hurt.
So just to follow up, if there are inputs from our aligned trading partners that would support the AI build out, should the administration consider providing relief on those inputs?
From my perspective, absolutely. Again, you may have others who say, "Oh, they can move their factories to the U.S., build it here." Is that even realistic? I think that's the conversation to be had. And so, yeah, absolutely. If you have an ally willing to supply it, they definitely deserve to be treated more gently.
So there's this relationship between AI, the build out, and digital trade that I think we've touched on, but what are we missing here, Khalil? Is there something else that we should be focused on how we look at this relationship or how we use the build out to support our digital trade objectives?
Yeah. No, I think that there's multiple different aspects, right? Some that we've already touched on a lot, where AI exports are just going to be an economic growth engine for the U.S., but also for our allies and their digital transformation. From a trade policy perspective, I think we focus on the different digital sovereignty measures that we see from our partners, and both seeking their commitment to keep their markets open and to not discriminate, but also to address their concerns. And I think what the USG did at the India AI Summit is a good start. We would add reliability and continuity of service, just a bit sort of directly taking on some partner concerns there.
So is that their relationship then between the build out and our competitiveness in service provision, digitally enabled services or other types of services? And should the United States government really be paying more attention to those competitive parts of the U.S. economy?
Absolutely. Yeah, and I think you made the point with your question, right? There's really the pace of change and innovation is so fast. And I think that the U.S. government is prioritizing it, but there's still more that can be done to prioritize it in our trade policy, and to work on shared interests with partners.
So we've got a little over 15 minutes left. I want to ensure that our audience gets a chance to answer or pose questions. So please, if you have questions, put them into the Q&A. The panel will be happy to take a look. So we definitely encourage your questions. But the one I want to transition to another topic, and I think this is going to be really quite important, especially as we move from IEEPA to Section 122, 301, 232 even, retaliation. So far, we've seen relatively muted retaliation against U.S. tariff actions. Canada and China in particular have retaliated, but could there be a greater potential for retaliation going forward if we're moving towards these other types of tariffs? Kate, do you want to start there?
Sure. Well, yeah, I guess there always could be. I mean, I think we have seen fairly muted retaliation against U.S. goods in particular. I think most policies which we have seen aimed at U.S. services providers, digital trade, the rest really are less about retaliation and more about creating a fair playing field for national champions to compete. So, I mean, I think the risk here is more about, countries copycatting certain measures if they think that there is something to be gained from going after certain companies, which are not their own national companies, either for, revenue raising measures or policies that are intended to cut the bigger players down in order to facilitate a greater competitive environment for those that are not able to compete. Now, we in the U.S., of course, as well have looked at different types of measures, not only tariffs, to address digital trade barriers. I think this remains an open question, particularly in the face of the IEEPA decision at SCOTUS. I mean, there are other things the United States can do in retaliation for barriers it feels are discriminatory against its own companies. We can see that in the form of tax measures. Of course, that was debated in Congress before the DST discussions at the OECD. I think the reality is that we may see more retaliation in the US in this space than externally.
So, and I hate to cut you off. It sounds like you have like 15 more minutes of questions, but
we only have 45. Great.
You only have 45 for the session, and we unfortunately need to wrap this one up. But really great conversation, guys. Truly grateful to you. I was just in this session after Jonathan was called the godfather of digital trade. I went back and actually found email traffic that I had with him in 2011. Talking about a new global, like we should have a global round on e-commerce and digital trade. So definitely been talking about these issues for a long time, and with all of you, really grateful. Ed, terrific moderation. Jonathan, thank you for all your good work over the years. Ari, for your partnership on so many things. Same Khalil and Kate. You were all great partners with WIDA, and we are truly grateful to all of you. Thank you for joining us. And with that, before we as we turn to our final session of the day, we want to call out some more of you, some more of those who are in community with us at our conference, even if you can't see them on screen. So welcome to 4 good friends of WIDA who we're so pleased could join us today. Sergio Gomez Lara, who's Mexico's Business Coordinating Council in Washington, Luke Harms with Whirlpool Corporation, Jordan Haas with Intel Corporation, and Dr. Sheng Liu at the University of Delaware. Welcome, Sergio, Luke, Jordan, and Dr. Liu, and welcome to thank you to everybody who's been sticking around for the afternoon. I'd like to now ask our next panel to please turn on their screens. The conference today has addressed key themes in the U.S. national security strategy. And to close out our conference today, we're going to dive into a topic that builds off our last session and all the issues we've been discussing today to talk about the tech-enabled metamorphosis of global manufacturing. To help us do this, we've brought together 4 newcomers to the platform, and we're honored they've taken time out of their busy days to help us glimpse a way forward into the world we are becoming. Michael Chico is President and CEO of FINUC America Corporation. Chris De La Roca is Chief Information Officer, Corporate Business Technology at Johnson & Johnson. Joe Stakunis is President of Semi America. And Joe Stakunis, and George Young is Vice President of Secure Digital Operations at Rockwell Automation. Thank you for joining us. And our moderator is Andrea Durkin, Vice President for International Policy at the National Association of Manufacturers, another of our conference and USMCA sponsors. I'm always grateful to you, Andrea, for your friendship and partnership.
Thank you, Ken, and thank you to everybody for sticking around for this last hour of this amazing conference. It's been really enriching and dense. I'm really delighted to moderate this panel on Manufacturing 4.0, which I think is bound to be a topic that's going to get much more attention in the coming months in the trade policy arena. And it dovetails really nicely with the last panel. So the last panel focused really heavily on the policy aspects. And I think what we have an opportunity here with these industry leaders to do today in this last panel is to really get a grounding on what Manufacturing 4.0 actually looks like in practice, from use of AI in manufacturing R&D to automation and robotics on the factory floor, to the deployment of digital software and digital tools to enhance the ways that manufacturers interact with their customers. In the case of J&J, are their patients. So thank you to all of you for joining the panel today. I'm going to kick it off with Mike Chico from FANUC. Mike, for those who don't know, FANUC is a global leader in factory automation, and we're all sort of cognizant of the fact that industrial robots are pretty cool today. They're faster, more flexible than ever, and ever present, and really critical to competitiveness. But to set the scene, help us understand what that really looks like in terms of deployment of automation and robots in different factory settings and for different industrial sectors.
Yeah, good afternoon, Andrea, and everyone else on the line. Ken and WIDA, thank you so much for the opportunity. As Andrea mentioned, FANUC is the world's leader in factory automation. It's actually incredible how much news and publication we're getting right now. But really, factory automation has been in place since the 60s, the 1960s, and it's been in factories for a long time. And I think that now, with some of the trade discussions that's really been happening since President Trump's first administration and now through his second administration, there's so much additional opportunity for us. So to kind of set the stage on factory automation, really throughout time, we focused pretty heavily on finding the worst possible areas of factories for people to be, we say dull, dirty, and dangerous, those types of applications. And all the way through Henry Ford inventing the first modern day assembly line, we found ways to automate those dirty, dull, and dangerous tasks away from getting people hurt or doing repetitive things and trying to really upskill the labor force. as we kind of moved into the Great Recession in 2009, which is getting now close to 20 years ago, the shift of the focus kind of changed a little bit, and we really started to recognize a pretty significant labor shortage that we have in manufacturing. And at the end of 2009, there was only, say, 90,000 open manufacturing jobs around. As you just fast forwarded a few years, that got up to 500,000 open manufacturing jobs. And then COVID really knocked that down a bit, but it jumped up to over 1 million open manufacturing jobs. And even today, where we sit right now, there's over 400,000 manufacturing jobs open in the United States. And Jim Farley, the CEO of Ford, talks about it quite a bit, that he has this huge gap of machinists and other things that he can't find. And so we've really shifted a focus to not just tackling the dull, dirty, and dangerous, but also finding ways to make factories more efficient, to make factories more productive. And I'm sure we're going to talk about it soon, but the use of AI and some of the software-enabled skills have really enabled robotics in general to be much more capable inside the factories themselves. If you turn on YouTube or probably in a lot of your LinkedIn feeds, you're going to see a lot of humanoid robots dancing around and doing flips and cartwheels and things like that. But really, to set the stage, the bulk, not just the bulk, almost exclusively the robots that are used in factories today are traditional, robotic arms and devices and things like that are moving goods around or handling goods. But they are in every single industry that you can possibly imagine, from farming to pharmaceuticals to consumer products to aerospace to now logistics, and certainly automotive as being the primary driver. But even today, automotive only represents about half or even less than half of the industrial robots that get sold into manufacturing today. So maybe a bit of a monologue to start things off, but that's kind of where we sit today.
No, that's really perfect. And when I first started looking into this and reading about it and reading about your company and what you do, I was really fascinated to understand sort of the global context here as well. So give us a sense of, in comparison, what is the sort of robot density in factories across the United States versus our competitors globally? How does that look?
Yeah, so the what's called the IFR, the International Federation of Robotics, is kind of our managing organization that tracks all the data. And they look at two pieces of data of how many robots get shipped in a period of time, and then how many manufacturing employees, based on different labor reports, are used. And so I actually printed them out, so I had them right in front of me. But so in total, in all of manufacturing, the United States has, and this is the year ending 2024, so they're always like a year behind. We have 307 robots installed for every 10,000 manufacturing employees in the job workplace. So 300 robots, 10,000 people. So the penetration of robotics into manufacturing, if you look at it that way, is pretty light compared to how many people are still needed there. The number one company is Korea, where they have 1,220 robots installed for every 10,000 manufacturing people. And even China, so a lot of people will think that, how big and how fast China has grown, and they're the number one consumer of robots by far, by 10, 20, 30 fold. They still only have 165 robots for every 10,000 manufacturing employees. It does change based on the industry. So just for the United States in automotive, if you just look at the automotive industry, there's 1,545 robots. So just about 1,600 robots for every 10,000 people. So the density is a lot greater in automotive, which means that in the rest of manufacturing, there's only 200 robots for every 10,000 people. So, maybe not as automated as some people think. And the use of, certainly we know that the use of people in manufacturing is ever important. And step by step, and I think we'll talk about a little bit later, that the use of AI and some of the new technologies of robots are bringing really where the robots are working literally hand in hand with the manufacturing workers. And so we're bringing that automation really tightly integrated with the people as well in the future.
Great. Thank you for setting the stage there, Mike. I want to turn to George from Rockwell Automation. George, I had the pleasure of going to the Rockwell Automation Fair last November. It was completely overwhelming. And what Mike was describing, the breadth of how robots are deployed in industry. But they have to be told what to do or made smart, and they have an opportunity to collect a lot of data. And so the automation is really a part of the whole digital transformation, journey that manufacturers are on. There's a whole ecosystem that needs to be in place for the robotics to deliver on their potential. So how does the physical then come together with, new software capabilities, AI, and connected devices so that that deployment of robotics can deliver data-driven value in manufacturing?
Yeah. So Mike laid out a nice history kind of automation, because Rockwell has been around. We started off as the Allen Bradley company more than 120 years ago. So mechanical actuation, mechanical and physical actuation to make machines, to build assembly lines, that's been around for a long time. But what is happening now, so maybe I'll just kind of maybe even explain my title, Secure Digital Operations. That's kind of what we're interested in now, because we're going to move from physical and mechanical into the use of sensing, to use feedback from programmable, like Rockwell makes these things called programmable logic controllers. We're going to be able to make manufacturing more efficient, safer, more environmentally friendly by taking real-time data that comes through sensing devices, sometimes cameras. You'll hear things about machine vision. We're going to use, cameras to become part of the control mechanism. So that means that we need to have security. So if we're going to use this data, our systems have to be cyber secure. And it also means that we're going to be using intelligent devices. We're going to be either programming, or now with the use of AI, we're going to have machines that are learning on the job, so to speak, to find safer, more sustainable, more efficient ways of doing things. So, that's basically my job, is security. It's the use of AI, and it's the use of software. So that's what you'll hear people talk about: IT, information technology, OT, operations technology, convergence. That's kind of these two things that come together, because increasingly the factory of the future is software defined.
Well, so you're collecting, so the machines are learning, but they're also collecting a lot of data that you can then use to optimize your operations or minimize waste or make other kind of decisions around your operations. Can you describe a few examples of that to help people understand how that's working?
Sure. There are so many different examples. It's almost hard to start. One, I'd like to point out, Mike talked about, the scarcity of workers. People have not been going into manufacturing. So part of it is, we're using these learning systems to not just replace, but train workers so that they can make better decisions on the job. So some of the things that we're doing are, we're doing what we call emulation and simulation, so that as we're having kind of a rebirth of manufacturing in the United States. And so what we can do is we can simulate an assembly line or a manufacturing line. We can train the workers on what is going to happen. We can even simulate a negative scenario, and they can react to it. It's almost like a video game. So some of the younger people really enjoy that. So that's one, that's one thing. But by using AI, by being able to run lots of simulations without actually physically running it on a plant, because if you're a plant manager, you don't want to go into a plant manager and say, I'm going to run an experiment on your plant. But by having these simulations, we can run these things offline. Then we can make changes. We can see it, observe it in practice, and then we can drive efficiency. Lots of, you mentioned, reduce waste. We've done some things in tire manufacturing that have reduced the amount of scrap in tire manufacturing by significant amounts. And then in medical device manufacturing, we've got Chris from J&J on. We want to make things right the first time, and we have to do it in a highly regulated manufacturing protocol.
Great. Well, that's a great segue to Chris. So Chris, for J&J, I mean, I think everybody's really familiar with J&J as a leading diversified pharmaceutical and a med tech company. But you're an active deployer of AI across, your entire operations from R&D to customer experience. So give us a sense of what that looks like for you.
Sure, and thanks for the invite, and great to be a participant. Yeah, so let's just start off. I think with J&J, we believe AI holds tremendous potential to advance human health, especially when it's combined with our scientific expertise and deep understanding of healthcare. We see AI as not just a tool; it's a force multiplier that helps us solve complex problems, and problems we just couldn't solve in the past. So we've seen a lot of value already over the last, I'd say, 5 years of investment significantly in this space. So for product development and design, we're using AI and data to basically to accelerate drug discovery and development in the pharmaceutical space, for example. We use AI to identify disease drivers, targets, for disease cells, and then select, optimize, and testing compounds at a high velocity and a higher probability of success. So, just to give some color to that, an example, we leverage vast amounts of data sets, internal public data, global data sets, as well as our own internal research to go through thousands of examples of molecules and compounds, maybe millions, to understand which ones would be most likely to have an effect, or which subset would have most likely have an effect on a particular disease cell target, usually an expressed protein on that disease cell. That's a massive amount of work that would normally be done through traditional search techniques, algorithms, but now much quicker and much more accurate. And then we'll use AI models to take that information and then, as was said earlier by George, actually simulate and predict the outcome of these molecules and particular recipes of compounds, if you like, to modify the design so that we can have a stronger binding affinity. The product will be more stable, more soluble, minimizing toxicity, and minimizing off-target effects. So it's often used to design well in advance of us actually building the compound on any scale. And then just for a little more flavor, in terms of testing, think of, again, thousands of different variations of particular compounds, and we want to understand if it actually will have an impact on an actual disease cell. So going back to Michael's comment on, this is not a task you want, humans to do, where you actually are exposing a disease cell with a particular compound. And so we're using advanced robotics to do that, but then we're capturing image before and after the cell is exposed to that particular compound, and photographing those two images, or taking those images, and then using machine learning and vision AI to actually quantify the reaction of that cell to that compound that's been exposed to. And that's then mathematically calculated to give you a sense of how big that reaction was. I kind of liken it to taking a photo of someone's face before and after being scared by somebody. So you kind of see that differentiation. So that's a couple examples in both in the design phase and the testing phase. And then in actual development and clinical trial itself, we're leveraging machine learning to actually design the trial. Again, we need real world data, global data sets, health data, historical trial performance in order to predict a location for an optimal trial. That could be anywhere in the world, and to identify patient populations where the demographic and clinical sort of characteristics really improve the enrollment efficiency, the representation of our patients, and overall study feasibility. Again, massive amounts of data. Disease has no boundaries, and so we need data sets where our patients are potentially going to be. So there's a couple examples of the R&D side. What I do want to point out that this is years of experience with traditional AI or machine learning that we have within our R&D units, and now we're responsibly exploring new opportunities to enhance that with things like generative AI and obviously towards agentic AI. So we've got a lot of experience, but at every single situation, I'm very I want to be very clear on this. We've ensured that people are at the center of this conversation, because in the end, we've got to have our scientific domain knowledge at the center with our human expertise, and obviously this is for patients, and so it has to be accurate and well tested.
Yeah, I mean, that's all incredibly fascinating and encouraging, given where you sit in terms of innovation for public health. But you haven't even touched on sort of how you deploy automation in the manufacturing process, maybe handling inventory and logistics and all that, which I presume you do.
Yeah, I think in manufacturing, I mean, I got a number of examples, I think, as George had, but in manufacturing, no question around improving efficiency, quality, and reliability through predictive maintenance and real-time quality monitoring. A new area for us is actually automating documentation, which is obviously done a lot across many processes, particularly in quality and in R&D. And then we're using advanced models to optimize the actual production processes themselves. Again, at any facility around the world. I mean, this is not just one particular location. In supply chain, I think everybody's probably leveraged or used machine learning for advanced forecasting using some sort of ensemble of models. But what we're now doing is overlaying Gen AI on top of that, so that the users can actually talk and ask questions about the recommendations from those models. So talk to your data is a kind of new thing that we're doing a little more. And then across commercial, which I think is really exciting, there's no question over the last 3 years, we've really created a much more personalized experience for our patients and for our healthcare professionals, rather than coming with a single drumbeat message over and over again, which, many of us have experienced. It's personalized. It's things that they're interested in. It's conversations we've had in the past, no longer having to recall or recite something. I don't remember what happened 2 weeks ago, but we now have that very personalized experience. So anybody who's engaging with a healthcare professional or a patient has got that 360 sort of understanding, and it's of something of interest to them based on their own interaction with our systems globally. And then I think one thing that's really interesting as well from a financial perspective, given that I've got some corporate accountabilities, we're seeing a lot of opportunity with AI applied to our accounts receivable and accounts payable processes. Accounts receivable, you're getting cash, you're trying to reconcile multiple levels of inconsistency between the pricing, maybe a discount, what the customer has paid. Again, back to Michael's point, this is types of roles and jobs and that roles and work that people really don't want to do, but it's something that we have to do in order to make sure we have a good overall customer experience. So there's a couple more examples. I could keep going, but that's it.
Well, it was a great microcosm, in terms of explaining just for one company all of the different ways this can get deployed. Joe, I want to bring you into the conversation as well. Semiconductors are a part of the entire manufacturing landscape. They're in everything. So explain a little bit about semi to begin with, and then the role of automation and software in semiconductor manufacturing.
Thank you, Andrea. It's good to be here and appreciate the opportunity. Are you guys okay? Hear me okay?
Yes.
Great. Sorry, I got a little bit of an interruption here. Again, so SEMI is the trade association for the end-to-end semiconductor manufacturing process, which is the most complex manufacturing process ever enabled. We are working to give you some feel for the dimensions at which we work, which is critical to the automation. Point is, if you take we're working now in the nanometer and angstrom range. We need to be able to control contamination, eliminate contamination of materials and particles, and operate at a precision of a nanometer. And to give you a feel for what a nanometer is, first of all, take a human hair and divide it 100,000 times, and you've got 1 nanometer. So that's the type of precision that we're working at. And to enable that, our entire process, well, not our entire process, but the key process is referred to as wafer fabrication, and we're building wafer fabs here in the United States, which is very exciting for us again. But that wafer fab process, we're operating again at that nanometer type precision, and it is a completely automated process. So there's just we're working the wafers themselves are about the thickness of a half of a human hair, and then we're building we're going through manufacturing process with 1,000 to 2,000 unit operations steps that are operating in that nanometer range that I mentioned. So everything's completely automated, and we've been utilizing machine learning in the industry for quite some time. Our wafer fab facilities are extremely expensive. Cost today to build one of the fabs is about $15 to $20 billion. And as a result, it's a very expensive operation, requiring a great deal of precision, and there's a great deal of focus on collecting data from the manufacturing process. Our leading manufacturers have been collecting as much as 5 billion bits of data a day, and have then large teams who are working to develop algorithms and put AI to practice. And that's again where we're at today. And of course, what it represents and the value it brings. It's very interesting to see. Everybody knows NVIDIA, of course, the manufacturer of the GPUs that are behind AI, and that's the most valuable company in the on Earth. And again, they don't make, but they sell semiconductors. And the most valuable company in Asia today is also part of our association. That's Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Corporation, and they make the semiconductors for AMD and for NVIDIA and for Apple and a host of people. And then the most valuable company in Europe today is ASML, which is an equipment company that makes the photolithography equipment that's necessary to put those patterns down on the semiconductors and build the semiconductors at the dimensional side where we're at. So again, completely automated, very much enabling the industry around the world to use AI. And with that, of course, so no person ever touches the wafer, completely automated, working at the dimensions that are unimaginable for most. So everything is automated and requires a software system to operate it. So one of the things I thought would be interesting to share with you all is that, the thing that we didn't get to yet is we also need a great deal of security. So cybersecurity in our industry is extremely important. And that's one of the things that SEMI does. So we're a standards development organization, and over the last few years, we've been developing cybersecurity standards that are put in place to ensure that the manufacturing process that we utilize is also secured from cyber attacks, and a critical aspect of what we do. A lot going on here in the U.S. Finally, I'll mention that really U.S. government's been very involved. SEMI was approached a few years ago, and government officials came to us and said, you realize that the chips we need for our defense systems are not manufactured here in the U.S. And we were all very aware, as most of us who work in the industry spend a lot of our time in Asia, where our manufacturing had moved to. But again, under the first Trump administration, the CHIPS Act was first talked about and had a good deal of support on both sides of the aisle. Came back to the Biden administration before it was actually approved, but that happened in August of 22. And now today we have the 5 leading manufacturers of semiconductors, the most capable companies to manufacture semiconductors, all building and operating facilities here in the U.S. So a lot going on here for us as well.
Joe, great survey on semiconductors. We haven't really dipped yet into sort of the nexus between manufacturing 4.0 and trade policy, and you touched on cyber as one facet of that. But what are some other? I mean, given that we've talked about all the data that gets collected that sort of is global data, moves across borders, that it's AI enabled. What are some of the other policies that SEMI is concerned with that really touch on and affect manufacturing 4.0 and manufacturers' ability to source globally, to manufacture globally, to serve global customers while protecting all these digital processes, protecting their data, protecting the software that runs it, et cetera?
So ours is a global supply chain. First, to start out, in the process of managing or manufacturing a semiconductor or a chip, as we most often commonly call devices, that chip in its manufacturing process, not unusual to cross an ocean 6 times. And with that, the data that's required to manufacture the chip, track the chip, that also is transferred. The design, it's not unusual to have the design done in the United States and the chip manufactured in anywhere. It can be manufactured in the U.S., can be manufactured in Asia, can be manufactured in Europe, and then it'll also end up, it may be designed in the U.S., the wafer manufactured in the U.S., but then the chip, the final packaging assembly done in Asia. And with that, we've got to be able to transfer data securely around the globe. And the control of that data transfer is something that gets a lot of attention today. And our companies are very much want to make sure that that can be done in an efficient and secure manner in order to make sure the device is pure when it goes into actual use and whatever the electronic device is. So that's critical to us. The supply chain is also critical. We've got to, in many cases, we are now sourcing. Chips have been really in mass manufacture since about the late 70s, early 80s. And back then, the process wasn't as complex. We used like 13 elements of the periodic table to manufacture a chip. We're now up to 61, and the critical minerals issues are really critical to us. So again, the control of that supply chain, ensuring a reliable supply of those materials is again something where we're getting an awful lot of involvement with the government. We meet regularly. Well, I'll be in Washington next week. We have over 100 of our member companies coming into Washington. We'll be on the Hill to talk about, for instance, trade issues. So tax and tariffs are very important to us, but then it goes through to ensuring that there's proper regulation on the materials use and availability of the supply chain.
Great. And Chris, you talked about all the collection of all this proprietary data and processes. What are you thinking about in terms of AI governance, risk management?
Yeah, I mean it's critical, and data is a big part of AI. You can't have successful AI without successful data governance, and then on top of that AI governance. And so for us, for J&J, trust is foundational. We kind of have 3 areas around risk management that we sort of focus on. So trust by design and governance. So we ensure that that trust is foundational to what we do all through the process, and AI is no different. And so what we've established is a strong governance and policy framework. All J&J AI applications are reviewed by a multifunctional sort of AI council before it goes to any sense of scale. And what I mean by multifunctional is not just within the business line or the function. It's across all the lines to ensure we're considering all the regulation, all different privacy regulation, especially, but also other concerns before it's actually approved. And then once it is approved and start to scale, we've built AI in our AI delivery or SDLC delivery lifecycle. These elements of security, fairness, ethics, and transparency, so that it's embedded throughout the whole process of development to ensure that we're doing responsible and appropriate use of AI. The second pillar is around people-centered AI. People remain at the center of all AI-enabled processes. for J&J, AI is designed to augment, not to replace human judgment, particularly in high stakes environments such as healthcare, R&D, and manufacturing. And so, we find that results not only in a high quality outcome, but it develops our talent and also reduces overall risk, because you've got well-informed individual that's managing or orchestrating these AI capabilities. And then the third pillar around risk management is workforce readiness as a risk mitigation. So, effective AI risk mitigation depends on a digitally fluent workforce. We're investing in upskilling all of our global employees so that they can safely and effectively pair their deep expertise with advanced AI technology, moving beyond AI adoption, which is kind of using AI, toward AI fluency, which is using AI well. So we enable innovation while ensuring responsible and compliant and confident use across the enterprise. So managing risk is a big part of that. And then from a policy perspective, I think through this discussion, it's clear that AI is if it's not already there, it will become a modern integral component of manufacturing, because it allows organizations of all sizes to amplify their capabilities, improve quality, as we've sort of discussed. And given the importance of that, I think, we believe policymakers should pursue clear and coherent and carefully designed frameworks so that AI can be, responsibly used, but while continuing us to allow for product innovation. J&J, we're actively engaged with policymakers, and we participate in industry forums like this to help build a shared understanding of how AI is actually used in the manufacturing environment, and then what is needed to enable safe and effective deployment at scale. And that, we believe that policy development benefits from drawing on manufacturers' real world experience, and so that we can give you good examples. We can walk through, with meaningful outcomes as to what it really means. And so, for us, from a policy perspective, an environment that is more global, it definitely, builds in trust and ethics and security, as we all discussed, but with innovation at mind as well. This will help strengthen the US competitive leadership in AI, while ensuring these technologies ultimately improve outcomes for patients and society. We think we can do both.
Yeah. So, I mean, J&J is really in a, if you think about where everybody is in their digital transformation journeys, you're pretty far along in your journey. But, George, you said something to me previously about how Rockwell, delivers products and services to manufacturers of all sizes who are in different stages of that digital transformation. So they may be, it's not just building new facilities that are tricked out with the latest thing, but really upgrading, brownfield facilities as well. So how important is the role of standards to ensure interoperability of systems, interoperability of data collection, storage, and usage? Because it's the global manufacturing.
Well, Chris could probably tell you this because he's probably struggling with this. What I say is, you need open standards because you need solutions that work across multiple platforms. Because what I say is everybody has everything. If I go to a company, they've grown by acquisition, or they've got, facilities all across the world. There's different types of things. So if we're going to leverage the power of Industry 4.0 or 5.0, all of these things have to talk to each other. So the open integrated systems is foundational, and it's not something that many people really think about, or it might not be too sexy to people, but the notion of having industry reference data architectures is incredibly important, because we've got to be able to access the data that these machines are producing. The other thing I'd point out is that Joe mentioned something. if you think about as he goes in his periodic table from 15 elements to 61, mining is really important. That's a really important industry. And mining tends to operate in giant macro cycles. So what does that mean? It means that, they haven't invested a lot. And so when you start talking about smart manufacturing, in addition to open standards, another challenge that me and my team address very frequently is how do we modernize? We have to modernize a plant before we can really digitize it. So, because you might be dealing with things literally from the 1950s. You're not going to get smart data out of that. So how do you build a program where you can do that? Because, Joe and his semi clients, they want to build these fabs.
Yeah.
So those are the things we're looking at.
Hey, George, maybe Andrea, sorry if I
Yeah, go
don't
ahead.
mind, I'll jump in because George brings up a really good point. I can't see the job titles of the audience of the people listening in, but in terms of as we move to AI and open standards in manufacturing, it's a really good point to bring up that not only do we need to consider these things, that very infrequently do we have a pure greenfield opportunity where we're like building a plant from the ground. Maybe Joe's guys, a couple of these chip factories that are going to pop up are going to be pure greenfields, but almost all of the time we're adding things to something that exists right now. And it's a really good point so that not only do we have to consider upgrading other things within the factory to be able to really take advantage of this, but step by step, we also have to continue to consider how to design our products for manufacturing that forever, whether it's, some of the consumer products that J&J makes, or cars, as Ford recently mentioned, where they're kind of trying to change the factory line concept or how Tesla does it. You really have to fundamentally think about changing the way you manufacture things to take advantage of a lot of these things. So if there's people online listening to that, it's very difficult to do it with all the existing equipment you have in your plant. You really do have to reconsider that, and some of the stuff's really old that's out there. So it's a really good point that George brought up. I just wanted to highlight that from my side as well.
Yeah, I think it's a great point to underscore. I think people sort of don't appreciate it enough. We're living in a policy space where we're hearing a lot of the sort of big, sexy new investments, but I mean, most of manufacturing is about this process that you've just described, right? About modernization of existing facilities, which is equally important. And we need trade to do it as well. There's a question in the chat about, bringing in equipment and inputs, and that's not just for greenfield. It's for modernizing. It's for modernizing existing factories and upgrading. Joe, you've mentioned sort of industry standards, that policies, the deployment of AI and everything else is moving so fast that governments should be paying attention to industry developed standards as part of this story about interoperability and appropriate standards.
It's really critical. We have partnered with NIST. We've also partnered with the Japanese government though as well, and we get the work effectively done in both cases. And again, I just can't emphasize enough that in our world it's a global economy, and we need to be able to conduct business in efficient methods with things moving around the world as much as they do. We're also looking at that security of the supply chain, and is another critical area that was really important to us. There's more of the, definitely a whole lot more of make things where you sell them as well as becoming prevalent and part of that security standard. But for us, it's never going to be a complete supply chain capability. So we do need to be able to do things efficiently, safely, and securely around the globe. And the standards really help us to do that. But it goes beyond that. We do need support from the government to recognize that these policies to be effective, we need to be able to conduct our business on a global basis.
Yeah, there's a question in the chat about how AIs and these processes you're describing are evolving more quickly than laws can be passed. And so how do policymakers ensure that, these frameworks keep pace with these advances? What more can we be doing to have conversations like this where we understand sort of where you are as manufacturers?
But one of the things we've done is within SEMI, within our own organization, is we recognized that about 4 years ago, and for the last 4 years, we've been holding an international policy summit, and we've worked real hard to bring 8 different governments to that meeting and to engage, and from there work on a daily basis with those governments to ensure they understand what the needs of our industry are to move forward. And it's been really effective in doing that. So really, really helpful to we haven't sat back and with the old adage of in Washington, right? If you're not involved, you're
I think
on the
it's if
menu.
you're not at the table, you might be for lunch or
If you're
something
not at
like
the
that.
table, you're on the menu. Yeah, so that age old. So we've been working that if you're not at the table, you're likely you could end up on the menu. So it's been something that we found is just a necessity. So we bring our leaders, our industry leaders, to the government on a regular basis to ensure that happens.
Well, broadening that out, the administration is very interested in robotics. I think they're about to maybe even a week or two have another robotics roundtable in Washington, and wanting to understand really what it's going to take to expand the use of automation across all facets of manufacturing in the U.S. I mean, Mike, what is your message then to the administration about what's needed in terms of the policy ecosystem to support that uptake?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I agree with a lot of the comments that Joe was making is that, the world does operate on a global supply chain. However, I think that the administration's drive towards making sure that we can make in America the things that we need for America is critically important. And so I think a lot of the overriding policy that is try to make more where we need it to use it is important. There's a question in the chat about 232 tariffs on robots. So for those of you that are online that don't know, the administration opened up a 232 tariff investigation on robotics and machine tools, not just robotics, but also machine tools, manufacturing machine tools last year. And that investigation, the comments of that have already been submitted, including by us, Andrea, with NAM, as well as our NAM, and as well as FANUC and many others. But I think from my perspective is that we do need a national robotics strategy in the United States, that's necessary. We can look at China as somebody that has done that. They started a policy in 2015, China 2025, where the Chinese government supported financially and the government supported action to bring more robotics locally into the Chinese market. And within the last 10 years, now it took 10 years, and in the last 10 years, now 50% of the robots that are used in China are produced in China. So it didn't happen. A couple of the things I would highlight for those listening is, number one, it didn't happen overnight. Number two, it was a supportive program. It was a strategic supportive program by the government that was funded in a lot of ways by the government to bring more of that technology into the country. And we're for that I think that kind of strategy would be very beneficial to our country to do that. Because right now, most of the industrial robots that are used in manufacturing are brought in. Now, fortunately, as maybe Joe mentioned it before, they are brought in by very, very solid trade partners of the United States, Japan and Europe being the two largest trade partners that are bringing industrial automation into the United States, which is good and solid. But I think a government-sponsored national robotics strategy is critically important for the future. I think that in the short term, additional tariffs on imported robots would slow down manufacturing. It certainly would as it drives the cost up in the short term. So I think, but long term, I do believe that manufacturing more in the United States is critically important. It's important not just from our military perspectives, but as certainly as Chris mentioned, bringing medicine and pharmaceuticals, let alone all the other things that J&J does. It's critically important that we define a strategy.
Great. Anybody else want to chime in on that question, or even more broadly? You're all leaders. When it comes to advancing these manufacturing 4.0 trends, you're all playing a really critical role in developing the products and developing the software behind the products, the machinery, and then deploying it in really innovative ways. But I mean, what do we need to do as a country to continue to be a global leader across these trends?
Maybe really quick, Andrea. Sorry, George, I'll let you talk. But you brought up something I forgot to mention is that from a software perspective, you mentioned software, and especially around AI. The new buzzword around us is called physical AI. So that's taking all the cool AI stuff that is developed on NVIDIA chips and through all this stuff that Joe's organization does. And it creates this brain that sits outside the robot. And you can imagine you can hook up an unlimited number of cameras and an unlimited number of sensors into this AI brain and let it figure things out. And then that AI brain tells a robot what to do and how to do it. And I will that from a strategy perspective, that talent and that knowledge does sit within the United States very securely. And so we need to protect that. We need to continue to build upon that and protect that. Where most of my discussion sat around the hardware side of things, but from a software, I mean, we really do sit in the epicenter of that, which is great, and it's ever growing. It really hasn't even, aside from all the great things Chris is doing on that side, as it comes to actually controlling a robot in a plant, is not yet even tapped, close to being tapped for what its potential could be in the future. Sorry, George, to interrupt you.
Actually, I was going to make a comment, Mike and Joe, but comment I wanted to make was our biggest challenge in the U.S. on a global basis is around workforce, is having the talent necessary. When I speak to our member companies, we've got a very nice growth profile in front of us. Our industry, it's very interesting right now. We were a growth industry for 50 years, and about 2020 we broke $400 billion in sales. And this year we'll break $1 trillion. So we've had our industry grow 2.5 times in 6-7 year period. So tremendous growth. Number one risk to us, though, in achieving our growth, maximizing our growth, is having the talent necessary. And we really have it's just basics. Like we've got to get out there and make young students aware of what the opportunities are and engage them and attract them to our industry, get them trained. We have wonderful educational systems in the United States today, but we're not attracting enough engineers into those roles. Things have kind of flipped around on us. So it's interesting from an AI perspective. The software is equally important, but it used to be we'd have 3 electrical engineers for every computer scientist, and now that's reversed and flat out we just don't have enough engineers. We need materials engineers and electrical engineers to make semiconductors, and we don't have enough. We've got great programs here. Those programs in the U.S., the advanced degrees, 70-80% are foreign nationals in those programs, and many of those folks would like to stay here and be part of our economy and part of our growth story in semiconductor. But then we have issues with immigration. So there's some real interesting complexities where policy comes into effect in supporting the educational programs and awareness that's necessary to bring people into STEM education. And then also being able to, we can attract some global talent, but we need to be able to keep those folks here and be part of our economy.
Yeah, Joe, I think that not only do you have to worry about the engineers, but I think a really untapped spot is at the community college level as well. And part of this robotic strategy has to be around education by far. We've taken a grassroots approach to this, and even with a grassroots approach and working with a couple strategic partners, we have over 5,000 robots and machine tools installed in schools just in the United States, where they're primarily in the community college level, and then high school being the next level, with a lot of the research organizations doing this, but we need manufacturing workers as much as we need engineers. And like I said, we've taken a grassroots approach. We're in 1,700 schools across North America, but boy, it can be so much bigger. And I think we're ready. I think now with the administration and the where people understanding what other college degrees are getting you in the workforce, people are recognizing that maybe going to community college and getting a professional certification to go into manufacturing is a good way to go too. Sorry, Chris.
We could do an entire panel just on workforce development, and we probably should. Great point. Sorry, Chris, you want to jump in?
No, I was just going to reemphasize. I think if we and when I mean the US can lead in global standards and drive that across you know our other countries, I think that'll be a huge benefit. The fragmentation will destroy our ability to leverage AI, you know, in a way that's any sense of scale. And then with talent, the conversation I'd like to bring up is that what I'm seeing, not just within the manufacturing space, but also in the office space, if you like, in the white collar work, is that you know the AI has jumped into the education landscape, and so what we're finding is we need to think about how do we keep this critical thinking as a key prerequisite, because otherwise, you know, people will begin to rely too much on the recommendations from these algorithms, and we still need that base core knowledge set, those hands-on skills, that hands-on thinking, to be very relevant into the world of AI.
Joe, you're so polite there with your hand up, please.
Thank you. Thank you, Andrea. Just I want to build on the comment on the community colleges and getting folks trained with those technical certifications is really important. And I want to make a comment. One of the areas that we're focused on in attracting people to our industry right now are folks who come out of our military. They served our country in a very important way. And in many cases, they certainly never manufactured a semiconductor, but their skills in operating sophisticated weapon systems, sophisticated aircraft, and nuclear subs is very relevant to our field. And we're actually going out there to the bases now and looking to try and attract them to our industry. So again, I don't need more competition, but I really, but this is one area where I think it's really worthwhile. Folks,
Rockwell's funding
good
a program
opportunities
like that.
Yeah, Rockwell's doing it. We have the Manufacturing Institute, partner sister organization of NAM, is doing that as well. And you're all right to bring that up in terms of workforce. I know we're coming to the end of the panel. I want to give Ken an opportunity to kind of come on and close out the day. But let me just say, I mean, thank you to Ken, because this is a little bit of an unorthodox panel in the sense that we sort of assiduously avoided deep dive on the trade policy side, mainly because we wanted to get across to the trade policy community that manufacturers are really uniquely positioned as both developers of the technology and deployers of these technologies, and that this is a real force multiplier, but we need the right policy ecosystem. But people kind of need to understand, you know, what the needs are in manufacturing, what the manufacturing equities are in this space. So very much appreciate, Ken, the opportunity to have us do this panel and start the conversation, and hopefully continue it on future panels. And thank you to all of you, Chris and Mike and George and Joe, for all of the detail that you provided to bring this to life for us. Thank you.
Thanks for hosting, Andrea.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. You know,
okay.
I was going to jump in and say, I actually know a former nuclear submarine commander who's now working at an energy firm. I had lunch with him just a couple of weeks ago. So you're on to there's not that many of them, there's not too many of them, but there's this, I know one in particular. We've truly covered an amazing range of issues today, guys. And this closing session is so important for our trade professionals and to make up our audience today and the WIDA membership. We sometimes get so wrapped up in a policy that we don't get under the hood and understand how things we're talking about with government officials translate to the shop floor. And I know I learned a lot today, and I'm truly grateful to you guys. Thanks to everyone who stuck with us. Tomorrow, we're going to kick things off with an in-person networking breakfast at 8:30 a.m. at the Ronald Reagan Building. And we'll go live on Zoom with our first session, both in person and online, at 9 a.m. We announced, as you can see on the agenda that we popped up there, that we're going to be addressing the IEPA fallout in our final panel that we've added to the agenda. Anyone who registered for the conference will receive a link to watch via Zoom, but we hope those of you in DC will join us in person. For those of you watching online Tuesday, you should have received a reminder from Zoom this morning with your link to watch online tomorrow, and you'll get another reminder about an hour before we kick things off tomorrow. Note that it's a different link than you had today. We look forward to seeing everyone tomorrow. Thank you all. Thank you to our panel, Chris, Michael, Joe, George, Andrea. Thank you for your partnership and your friendship in helping put this panel together, and your support for WIDA's work, and you're a member of WIDA's board of directors, and we're truly grateful to you as well. Thanks, everybody. Have a great